Arizona October bleeds copper across rock that never apologizes. On the ridge, a rider hauls his horse short. Below him, a thin gray thread of smoke rises from a ranch that should have stood empty for 6 weeks. He drops through juniper and shale. A corral that was not there. Horses brushed, watered, standing easy. Garden rose straight as a blade. Bread on the wind. Women's laughter through the wall. Then silence, cut clean. His boot hits the porch. The lock he bolted is splintered, made presentable. The door gives. Firelight. 4 women turn toward him. None smile. None leave the hallway. He steps. They close ranks. From the dark at the back of the house, a baby cries. Arizona in October didn't so much end the day as let it bleed out slow. The light going long and copper across the rock. The shadows stretching thin as knife blades between the junipers. It was, Garrett Holt had always thought, a country that looked most beautiful right when it meant you the least good, all that gold light lying easy over ground that would kill a careless man just as readily in October as it would in July, and never once apologize for the difference. He'd learned that lesson early, learned it the way most lessons out here got taught the hard way, more than once until it finally stuck. The ridge gave him the smoke before it gave him anything else. Garrett Holt pulled the reins. Hard. His horse fought the bit for a second, then stopped, hooves skidding in the loose shale. He didn't notice he was looking down at the valley, at the thin gray line rising straight up into a sky the color of an old bruise. Smoke, from a chimney that should have been cold for 6 weeks. His hand moved to his hip before his mind caught up with it. Old habit, the kind that doesn't ask permission. Because a man doesn't spend 4 years in cavalry blue without his body learning a few things his conscience never agreed to. Smoke means people. People mean trouble. That was the whole equation, as far as Garrett's nervous system was concerned, and nothing about the last 10 years had given him a reason to argue with it. He sat there a long moment, just looking, just breathing. Arizona territory stretched out below him in October gold, all rock and rust and long shadow, beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful right before they take something from you. He had ridden away from this ranch 6 weeks ago, with the roof half caved and the windows filmed gray with dust and the whole place looking like something already dead. That had been the plan. Leave it alone. Let it sit. Come back when the deed was settled in his head, the way it was settled on paper, and start over, clean, alone, the way he'd told himself he wanted it, alone. He'd been very specific about that word. Now there was smoke, and under it carried up the slope on a wind that smelled like wood smoke, and something else, something warmer, bread. Actual bread. Baking. The word landed strange in his chest. Foreign. Like a language he used to speak and had let rot from disuse. He nudged the horse forward. The trail wound down through juniper and broken rock, and the closer he got, the less any of it made sense. Because there where there had been nothing 6 weeks ago, nothing but weeds and a sagging rail, there was a corral now, 4 horses in it. Brushed. Watered. Standing easy the way animals stand when somebody's fed them right and talked to them soft. Somebody who knew horses had built that corral. Past it, a garden. Rose straight as a ruler line. Squash, vines fat and green, curling low, catching what was left of the afternoon light. And under the porch eaves, bundles of something drying sage, he thought, and other things he didn't have names for. Somebody hadn't just camped here. Somebody had settled in, claimed it, made it theirs in 6 weeks while he was gone. By the time Garrett swung down off the horse, the cold thing in his chest had stopped being confusion and turned into something with edges. He'd learned this feeling in the cavalry, learned to keep it leashed, because rage in a soldier gets men killed. What was left now wasn't rage exactly. It was colder than that. It was the tired certainty of a man who has been played before and recognized the shape of it happening again. He was done losing ground. He was 3 steps from the porch when he heard the laughter. Women's laughter. Low, worn soft at the edges, the kind that only comes from people who've earned it the hard way, through hardship, through nights that didn't end well. It drifted through the wall like it belonged there. Then his boot hit the first step, and it stopped. All at once, cut clean like a blade through thread. The silence that followed had weight to it, held breath. The kind of quiet that comes right before something breaks. Garrett climbed the last 2 steps slow. One hand drifted near his holster not because he meant to use it, just because some reflexes don't ask first. He'd sworn off carrying a gun for anything but hunting, 3 years back. Standing there now, hand hovering, he understood exactly how much that promise was worth. The door gave under his palm without any fight at all, which stopped him cold, because he remembered locking it. Tested it twice, in fact, the morning he rode out. Remembered the stubborn resistance of that old iron bolt. Now it hung broken. Splintered wood around the frame, fixed just enough to look whole from a distance. Somebody had forced their way in, and somebody had gone back afterward and made the damage presentable. Warmth hit him first. Real warmth. Fire warmth. Not the dead cold he'd left the place in. Then light, clean light pouring through windows that had been scrubbed until the glass practically disappeared. Then the room itself, and none of it matched the picture in his head. A fire in the stone hearth, built high, tended. Wood stacked with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who understands that winter doesn't forgive mistakes. A table near the kitchen wall, scarred but solid, joints fitted tight by somebody who knew what they were doing with a plane and a chisel. 4 chairs around it, none matching, each one mended by a different hand. Quilts hung along the north wall, blocking a draft he'd never gotten around to fixing. Herbs swung gently from the rafters overhead, throwing soft moving shadows across a floor that had been scrubbed down to Berber grain. The whole room breathed the stubborn care of people who'd worked because they had no other option. Because giving up wasn't a door that was open to them. And in the middle of it, 4 women turned to face him. None of them smiled. None of them looked away. The oldest stood nearest the table, gray threading dark hair, pulled back in a braid that spoke of decades of practice, not vanity. Her eyes were brown and calm, and did not flinch when they met his. There was a stillness in her that Garrett recognized. The stillness of somebody who had already survived worse than whatever he was about to say. By the hearth, a second woman. Black hair catching firelight, dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him pause without quite meaning to. She'd placed herself half a step ahead of the others, a guard's position. Her hands hung loose at her sides, too loose, the deliberate looseness of somebody ready to move the instant they had to. Third, younger, reddish-brown hair, both arms wrapped tight around a bundled blanket held against her chest like a shield. Couldn't have been more than 20. Her face still had that unmarked softness young faces carry, except her eyes kept darting past him, toward the hallway, toward whatever she was guarding with her whole body. And a fourth, standing slightly apart, straight-backed, dark hair. The unmistakable posture of somebody who used to belong somewhere finer than this. You could see it, in the folded stillness of her hands, except her fingers were trembling, just slightly, the only crack in an otherwise perfect composure. Nobody spoke. The oldest woman broke it first. Her voice came out even, practiced. The voice of somebody who'd spent years standing in front of rooms that didn't want to listen to her. "You must be Mr. Holt." Not a question. "I am." The door clicked shut behind him, loud in all that quiet. He looked around the room again, slower this time. Not just seeing the changes now, seeing the labor behind them, the hours, the absolute nerve of it, walking onto a stranger's property, breaking his lock, building a life inside his walls, and now standing there like he was the one who needed explaining. "I bought this place to sit empty a few weeks," he said. Level, controlled. The voice he used to give orders in, back when men still had to listen. Not to come home and find it full of strangers. Nobody answered, pulled tight. Then the oldest woman gave a small nod, barely a dip of the chin. "That's fair." Her calm made it worse. Sharpened the heat behind his ribs instead of cooling it. Fair. The word came out harder than he meant it to. "You knew this ranch was mine." "We heard," said the elegant one by the window, voice soft, educated, careful. "In town?" The young one with the bundle dropped her eyes to the floor. It was the woman by the fire who answered. "In the places men talk freely, because they think women too frightened to do anything with what they hear." That landed somewhere Garrett didn't expect it to, because it was true. He'd heard men talk that way himself, more times than he wanted to count. Watched them do it without a flicker of shame, especially about Apache women. Especially about women with nowhere to go, and nobody standing behind them. Then something else caught his eye. The 4 of them weren't standing at random. They'd formed a line, subtle but deliberate, between him and the dark hallway leading to the back rooms. His gaze slid there. All 4 women shifted. Small movement, barely visible, except it was practiced. Rehearsed, like a maneuver they'd run before. His voice cooled several degrees. Dropped into the register he used to use interrogating prisoners, who thought silence would save them. What's back there? The young woman's knuckles went white around the bundle. Mr. Holt, the oldest, said, "What's back there?" He took a step. The woman by the fire matched it exactly, closing the gap she'd need to. "You came in angry," she said. "Hear us if first. I didn't ride onto my own land to ask permission to breathe in it." Another step, and this time, all four of them moved, not wild, not panicked, just tightening the line, making it plain he'd have to go through them to get to whatever was back there. It was such a quiet act of defiance that his anger cracked just slightly and changed shape underneath it. Because these weren't squatters braced to run, weren't thieves with an eye on the door. These were people guarding something. Somebody. His eyes found the young one again. Her face had gone the color of old paper. "Move." "No." A whisper, almost swallowed by the fire's crackle. Almost. He heard it anyway. And then, from the back room, a sound so small it could have been the wind finding a gap in the wall. Could have been the floor settling. Except Garrett knew that sound, had heard it in villages, in camps, in the exact wrong moment more than once, in a war he didn't like remembering. A baby cried. The room went still in a way it hadn't been still before. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Every woman in that room turned toward the hallway at once, toward the sound, toward the thing they'd been standing guard over the entire time. The young one broke first, turned, hurried through the doorway without a word, footsteps quick and light on the boards. Garrett stood where he was, fire on one side of him, cold anger on the other, both fighting for the same space in his chest. A child. They'd brought a child into an empty ranch in the middle of open country. That single fact rearranged everything else in the room. The oldest woman folded her hands over her apron. Steady, centered. "Now you understand." He looked at her sharp. "I understand you brought an infant to a house with no doctor for 50 miles, no help. No protection but 4 women and a broken lock. We brought her somewhere she could live," said the woman by the fire, quiet, but with iron underneath it. He turned on her. "And when the first hard freeze comes, when the food runs short, when some man rides out here with bad intentions and finds 4 women alone." Her eyes didn't waver, didn't so much as blink. "That's already happened. Somewhere else. We're still here." The elegant woman flinched just once, a small tightening through the shoulders. Not at his words, at the memory underneath them, at something she wasn't ready to look at straight on. Garrett studied their faces one at a time. Fear, yes, but also resolve. The bone-deep exhaustion of people who'd been running a long time and had finally simply stopped. None of them looked ashamed. And that unsettled him worse than tears would have. Worse than begging. They stood there like this was theirs by right earned through sweat, through the labor written into every corner of that room. He walked past them. Nobody stopped him this time. The back room had been storage. Last he remembered it. Empty crates. A dirt floor he'd meant to plank over eventually, when he had time, when there was reason to bother. Now a narrow bed stood against the wall, hand-built, simple, solid. A crib made from old crates sat near the stovepipe, in the warmest corner of the room. A patchwork quilt hung over the window, blocking the draft, buying privacy. The young woman stood beside the crib, a baby against her shoulder, rocking in that rhythm as old as anything. Dark curls, a round, sleep-flushed face. One small fist wrapped tight in the fabric of the girl's dress. Garrett stopped in the doorway, couldn't make himself go further. The girl turned slightly, angling her body between him and the child. Protective even now, even terrified. "This is Sable," she said. Her voice shook on the way out, but she got it said. "She's mine." Garrett looked at the baby, at the small fist gripping fabric, like it was the only solid thing in the world. Then at the girl, at the fear and the defiance running through her at the exact same time, neither one winning. Whatever hardness had carried him into that room went out of him. What was left underneath it was just the plain, heavy fact that this had stopped being simple the moment he walked through his own front door, that it had never been simple, that nothing worth understanding ever was. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. The others had followed, kept their distance, gave him room. "How old?" he asked. It was the only question that came to him. 8 months. The young mother's voice steadied, finding solid ground somewhere underneath the fear. "Born in February." Sable stirred against her shoulder, blinked dark eyes at the strange man in the doorway. Settled again, trusting, against the only shoulder she knew. Garrett had buried both his parents before he was 25. Had bought land and sold horses, and negotiated contracts across 3 territories. Thought he understood, in a general sort of way, what it meant to have the ground shift under you when you weren't braced for it. Except there's a difference between hearing that people have fallen on hard times and standing in a doorway looking at the proof of it. An 8-month-old child, breathing soft and easy, in a room some stranger had built out of crates and desperation and love. In that order, or maybe all at once. He made himself look at the walls. Really look. Scrubbed to bare wood in places. Shelves built by hand and mounted with care. Jars of preserves lined up neat as soldiers. Somebody had been thinking about winter, before winter even asked to be thought about. They hadn't drifted through this place waiting for him to come drag them out of it. They'd saved it. Taken something dying and put breath back into it. Something moved behind his eyes then. Uninvited. A creak. A different one farther north 3 years gone. A woman running. A child in her arms, small, dark-haired. No older than Sable was now. He shut it down before it could finish. Hard. The way he'd trained himself to shut it down every time it tried to surface, which was often, and which never once got easier no matter how many times he told himself it would. Not now. Not here. He made himself breathe. Made himself look at the shelves again, the jars, the fresh planed wood, until the room in front of him was the only room that existed. He stepped back into the main room. Slower now, giving himself the time he needed to decide what kind of man he was about to be. "I want the truth," he said. The oldest woman gave a single nod. "You've earned that much. Then start with names." She lifted her chin, met his eyes straight on. Agatha. The young mother came through the doorway behind him, Sable awake now, wide-eyed, taking in the strange room and the stranger both. "Ida," she said. The elegant one, voice quiet and clear. Adeline, last. The one by the fire, the one who'd matched him step for step, who still watched him like he might yet turn out to be exactly the threat she expected. Senna. Garrett repeated the names silently. Fixed them in place. Agida. Adeline. Senna. Not strangers anymore. People, with names, with stories. He was about to be responsible for whether he wanted the weight of them or not. He reached into his coat, pulled out the folded deed, set it on the table between them. It made a small, dry sound against the wood. "This is mine," he said. "That's the law." Agatha inclined her head. "Accepted it, yes. But I'm not putting a baby out in the cold before I know what kind of trouble I've ridden into." He looked around the room, let them all see he meant it. "So you're going to tell me all of it, why you're here? How long? And who might come looking?" Ida's arms tightened around Sable. The baby made a small sound, not distress, just awareness, the way babies register a room's temperature shift before anyone says a word. Adeline looked toward the window, toward the fading light, toward something a long way off that had nothing to do with the ranch at all. Agatha pulled out a chair. Didn't sit, just rested one hand on the back of it, steadying herself the way you steady yourself before stepping into cold water. "Then you'd better hear it all," she said. And she told him. "I taught at the Indian school near Fort Halden," Agatha began. Garrett knew the place. Everybody in the territory did. Knew what it was built to do, take Apache children, and remake them into something the government found acceptable. Strip the language out of them first, the rest would follow. I taught what they told me to teach: reading, scripture, penmanship. She looked at the fire instead of at him. But I also taught them their own language, when nobody was watching. Songs their grandmothers sang, stories their fathers told before the schools ever got hold of them." Her hands folded tighter, knuckles pale. "They found out what happened. The headmaster said I was undermining the mission, said I was keeping the children savage instead of civilizing them." She said the word civilizing like it tasted bad in her mouth. "They dismissed me. No pay for the last 2 months. A warning that if I spoke against the school, I'd be arrested for inciting unrest." Garrett said nothing, because what was there to say? He'd seen those children come back to the reservations afterward, watched them stand in a room full of their own family, unable to speak the language of the people who loved them, caught between 2 worlds and welcome in neither one. He'd seen it, and done nothing. Told himself it wasn't his business. Agatha lowered herself into the chair at last, slow like someone twice her actual age. "I'm 55, Mr. Holt. Nobody hires a woman my age, especially not one the government's already called a troublemaker." She watched the flames a moment, "So I came here." Garrett turned to Ida. The young woman was still swaying, gentle, automatic, even though Sable had gone quiet against her shoulder. The movement of a mother who'd learned to soothe without needing to think about it anymore. Your turn, he said. Not unkind, I married a blacksmith. Her voice was softer than Agatha's. Younger. Something in it that sounded like it could crack if you pushed too hard. In Tucson, his name was Thomas. He was kind, at first. She swallowed. When I told him I was expecting, he was happy. Said he wanted a son. Somebody to teach the trade to. Her throat worked. She stopped. Couldn't finish it. Senna moved a half-step closer. Didn't touch her. Just stood near. A quiet presence that didn't ask anything of her. Ida took a breath and tried again. She came out with dark skin, dark hair. His people don't have those features. Mine do. She looked down at the baby instead of at Garrett. Thomas said she couldn't be his. Said I'd been unfaithful, he threw us out. Told the whole town I'd dishonored him. Her eyes filled, but she refused to let it spill over. Nobody questioned a white man's word over an Apache woman's. I went back to the reservation, she went on. Now. But they wouldn't take me either. Said I'd chosen a white man over my own people. That I'd already left, so I didn't get to come back just because it got hard. Her voice dropped to something barely audible, so I had nowhere. No husband, no family, no home. Until I found Agatha. Agatha reached over. Squeezed Ida's hand once brief, firm. Let go, the gesture said what words couldn't have managed as well. You're not alone, you're safe here. You belong. Garrett felt something twist behind his ribs. These women hadn't just had bad luck. They'd been failed, deliberately, by every structure that was supposed to protect people like them, by husbands, by towns, by their own communities. And they'd survived it anyway. Found each other. Built something out of it that hadn't existed before they showed up with nothing but their hands and their stubbornness. He looked at Adeline last, the elegant one, arms crossed, watching him with something that wasn't quite hostility, more like the careful assessment of somebody who'd learned to read a man's intentions before he showed them himself. I was married to a cavalry officer, she said. Her voice had an edge in it now, colder than anger. Sharper. Lieutenant Marcus Foss. Stationed at Fort Kestrel, she walked to the window. There wasn't anything to see out there anymore, the sun had gone down while they'd been talking. But she looked out anyway, at her own pale reflection in the glass. Marcus respected the Apache, learned some of the language, treated the scouts like men instead of tools. A pause. That made him unpopular in the wrong circles. Garrett waited. He knew where stories like this one went. Last year he found irregularities in the supply contracts. Food meant for the fort arriving spoiled. Blankets thin as paper and half-rotted with mold. Medicine that had been cut with something water. Chalk? Who knows? Her jaw tightened. He started keeping records. Names. Dates. Amounts. He said if he was going to bring it to the territorial governor, he needed evidence nobody could wave away. And 2 weeks later, his horse threw him on a routine patrol, broke his neck. Her eyes were dry, burning anyway. They said the saddle girth snapped. You don't believe that. Marcus checked his tack every single morning of his life. First thing he did, before coffee, before anything. Her voice had gone flat and cold as creek ice. That girth had been cut, halfway through. Enough to hold until it didn't. Something cold settled low in Garrett's gut. Who? Adeline turned to face him. And for a moment nobody in that room moved. A man who held the supply contracts for 3 forts in this territory, she said. A man who was pocketing the difference between what the government paid and what he actually shipped. A man Marcus was 3 weeks away from proving it on. Do you have a name? She hesitated. Just a heartbeat. Long enough that Garrett understood before she even said it, that whatever came next was going to change the shape of the room. Cormac Voss. The name hit the air and just sat there. Garrett didn't move, didn't trust himself to, because he knew that name. Knew it the way you know the name signed at the bottom of your own deed. The man who'd sold him this ranch 6 weeks ago, for less than half what any sane appraiser would have put on it. The man who'd pushed for a fast closing. No inspection, no questions. Just sign here, Mr. Holt, and the place is yours. You're certain, Garrett said. His voice came out lower than he meant it to. I've had a year to be certain, Adeline said. A year of watching him keep his contracts, keep his fortune, keep every single thing he had before Marcus started asking questions. While I was given a week to vacate officer housing. No pension. No explanation. Just orders. Senna spoke for the first time since the names had been given, and her voice had a different weight to it than the others. Older than her years, worn smooth by something she wasn't telling yet. I knew Adeline at the fort, she said. I scouted for the cavalry there, translated, when they needed it, which was less often than they should have. Her eyes stayed fixed on Garrett. I was there the morning they found Lieutenant Foss. I saw that girth before anybody thought to hide it. Garrett's attention sharpened on her like a blade finding an edge. You saw it cut. I saw a clean line. Not a fray. Not wear. A cut, made with something sharp, meant to hold just long enough. Her mouth was a hard, flat line. I said so. To the officer in charge of the investigation. And within the week I was told my services were no longer required. That an Apache scout's word wasn't testimony a territorial board needed to hear. Something moved behind her eyes, old anger, banked but not gone out. I've been careful ever since. Careful gets you a long way in this country, if you're the kind of person nobody's inclined to believe. Garrett looked between the two of them. Adeline, straight-backed and burning quiet. Senna, coiled and watchful. A woman who'd learned the hard way exactly how little her own eyes were worth to men with badges and bank accounts. He looked down at the deed, still sitting on the table between them. At his own signature, dried black months ago, next to Voss's careful, unhurried script. Half what it was worth. He'd thought he was getting a bargain. Now the word tasted like something else entirely. He sold me this land cheap, Garrett said half to himself. Pushed to close fast. No inspection. I thought. He stopped, because he didn't much like finishing that thought out loud. You thought you'd gotten lucky, Senna said. Not unkind. Just plain. I thought a lot of things. Nobody argued with that. Outside, full dark had come down over the valley without any of them noticing it arrive. The fire cracked and settled. Sable made a small, drowsy sound against Ida's shoulder and went quiet again. Garrett stood there a long moment. 4 women, 1 baby. A dead lieutenant whose only crime had been doing his job honestly. A cheap ranch that suddenly didn't feel cheap at all. It felt like something he'd been handed on purpose, by a man who'd wanted it far away from anyone still asking questions. He thought about riding out the way he'd planned. Alone. Rebuilding something small and quiet, and entirely his own, the way he'd told himself he wanted, after everything the war had cost him. Except that plan had a hole in it now, the size of 4 women and an infant with nowhere left to run to. And except this was the part that stuck in him worse than anything else a part of him had already decided. Somewhere between the corral and the crib, and the sound of that baby crying in a room he used to call storage. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. You should have told me all this from the porch, he said finally. Would you have listened from the porch, Agatha asked. Not sharp, just honest. He thought about that. About the man he'd been walking up those steps an hour ago, hand near his gun, jaw locked, certain he already knew exactly what kind of trouble he'd ridden home to. No, he admitted, probably not. Something in the room eased, just slightly. Not trust yet, not anything close to it, but maybe the first thin thread of it, stretched between 5 strangers and 1 sleeping child in a house none of them had any real right to, except every right that mattering could earn a person. So Garrett said, here's where we stand. They waited. I paid good money, bad money apparently, but money all the same for a ranch I intended to rebuild alone. He looked at each of them in turn. Agatha's steady patient. Ida's fear softening now into something like hope she didn't quite trust. Adeline's grief burning low and controlled. Senna's guarded, unreadable calm. I'm not turning a baby out into October cold to prove a point about who signed what paper. Ida's breath caught audibly. But I want the truth as we go, Garrett went on. All of it. Every piece. Because if Cormac Vossov sold me this land to bury what he did to your husband, he nodded to Adeline, then he's not a man who's going to just let that lie quiet forever. Not once he learns you're still breathing under his old roof. Silence again. But a different kind now. The kind that comes when people start doing the arithmetic on how much danger they're actually standing in. He doesn't know we're here, Ida said, hopeful, quiet. He will, Senna said. Flat. Certain. Men like that always find out. It's the one thing they're reliably good at. Garrett looked at the door. At the broken lock somebody had patched well enough to hold. At the dark beyond the window where, for all any of them knew, a rider could already be watching the smoke from this very chimney and drawing his own conclusions. Then we don't wait for him to find out on his own terms, Garrett said. We get ahead of it. Agatha studied him a long moment, weighing whether a person's promises were worth the breath it took to make them. You mean to help us, she said. Not quite a question. Testing the shape of it. I mean, Garrett said, That I bought a ranch with a dead lieutenant's blood already dried into the deed and I didn't know it until tonight. That makes it my business whether I like it or not. That's not the same as wanting to help, Senna said. No, Garrett agreed. It isn't. He let that sit a moment. Let it be honest, instead of comfortable. But it's a start. Nobody slept easy that night. Garrett least of all. He sat on the porch long after the fire inside had burned down to coals, staring out at a dark that felt thicker than it had any right to be. Somewhere out there was a man who'd sold him a ranch the way a snake sheds a skin it doesn't need anymore. Quick, clean, no looking back. A man who'd killed once already for far less reason than 4 women, and a journal's worth of buried truth. The door creaked behind him. He didn't turn. Didn't need to. He already knew the weight of that particular footstep. Senna sat down a few feet off. Not close, just near enough that the silence between them stopped being empty and started being something else. For a while, neither of them said anything. The stars came out hard, and bright, and indifferent, overhead the way they always did in this country, like the sky had never once bothered keeping track of what happened underneath it. You didn't have to let us stay, Senna said eventually. I know. So why did you? Garrett thought about that longer than the question probably deserved. Thought about a creek somewhere in his memory he tried very hard not to visit. Thought about a promise he'd made himself 3 years ago, and had already, in the space of one evening, started quietly breaking. Because I've done enough harm in my life, he said finally. I wasn't looking to add to the pile. Senna looked at him sideways. Something in her expression shifted, not warmth exactly. Not yet. But the cautious lowering of a guard that had been up a very long time. You were a soldier, she said. Not a question. Cavalry, 3 years. Did you fight Apache? His jaw went tight before he could stop it. Yes. The silence that followed was longer than the one before it. Heavier. My people have a saying, Senna said at last, standing, brushing dust from her skirt like she was closing a door on the conversation before it could go any further tonight. The man who stops walking in blood doesn't erase his footprints, but he can choose a different road. She turned toward the house. Good night, Mr. Holt. And she left him there, alone with the stars and the smoke long gone cold in the chimney behind him, and the unfamiliar sensation of a man who had ridden home expecting to lose something, and instead somehow, impossibly had found the first thing in 3 years that felt worth staying for. He didn't sleep. He didn't try very hard to. Because somewhere out past the ridge, past the dark shapes of juniper and stone, a man named Cormac Voss was almost certainly asleep in a warm bed, entirely unaware that the ranch he'd sold off cheap to bury his sins was now home to the one woman on earth who'd watched him cut a good man's saddle girth and lived long enough to say so out loud. That wouldn't stay true for long. Garrett understood that much already. The only question left was which one of them would run out of time first. Morning came in gray, then gold, then loud. Loud because Ida was already at the stove before the sun had properly cleared the ridge, and Agatha was already giving orders in a voice that made it clear she'd run rooms full of children and did not intend to stop now, just because the room in question was a ranch house and the children were, in fact, 3 grown women and 1 large, silent man still working out where he fit in all of it. Garrett came out onto the porch with his coffee and found the whole operation already 3 steps ahead of him. You're up early, he said. We're always up early, Agatha said, not looking up from the bread she was turning out of its pan. Habit doesn't know it's allowed to rest just because the danger got a little more specific overnight. He almost smiled. Almost. I want to talk terms, he said instead. That got her attention. She set the bread down, wiped her hands on her apron. Slow, deliberate, the motion of a woman buying herself a second to think before she answered something that mattered. Terms, she repeated. You heard me. Senna came around the side of the house just then, leading one of the horses, and stopped when she caught the shape of the conversation. Adeline appeared in the doorway a moment later, Sable balanced on Ida's hip behind her. Within a minute, the whole household had assembled itself around the porch steps without anybody quite calling a meeting. I'm not interested in charity, Garrett said, looking at each of them in turn. Not giving it, not receiving gratitude for it, not standing here every morning wondering if I'm being taken for a fool by 4 women smarter than I am. That's blunt, Adeline said. It's meant to be. Senna crossed her arms. So what are you proposing? Work real work. Split fair. The fence needs reset before the ground freezes. The barn roof leaks in at least 2 places I saw last night. Somebody's been keeping the books in their head instead of on paper, and I'd guess that's you." He nodded at Adeline, who blinked, surprised he'd noticed. "I'll buy what stock and tools we need before winter closes the roads. In exchange, everybody works, everybody eats, and nobody owes anybody anything they didn't earn." Agatha studied him a long moment. "And if we disagree on how a thing ought to be done, then we argue about it like reasonable people, and if that doesn't settle it, we vote. Even if you lose. Even then," he said it plain, no hedge in it, "I've spent enough of my life following orders I shouldn't have. I'm not looking to hand that particular habit off to somebody else just because I happen to hold the deed." Something passed between the four women, a glance, quick, wordless, the kind of conversation people have when they've lived close enough together, long enough to not need actual words for it. "Agreed," Agatha said finally. "Agreed," Adeline echoed. Ida nodded, quiet sable gumming at her own fist against her mother's shoulder, entirely uninterested in the historic nature of the moment. Senna didn't answer right away. She looked at Garrett a beat too long, like she was still deciding whether a man's word was worth the breath it cost him to say it. "I'll hold you to it," she said at last. "I'd expect nothing less." That, apparently, was as close to a treaty as any of them needed. The morning went back to being loud again: bread, coffee, the busy clatter of people who finally had something worth being busy over. The days that followed didn't feel like a rescue. They felt like work, which suited Garrett fine, because work he understood. Grief he understood less. Four women learning to trust a stranger with a gun on his hip, and a war he didn't talk about that. He understood least of all, and so he did the only thing he knew how to do about it. He showed up. Every morning. Did his share and then some. "You're doing that wrong," Agatha told him. The third morning, watching him wrestle a length of fence wire into submission with more force than sense. "I've strung fence before." "Not like that. You haven't." She set down the basket of eggs she was carrying and crossed to him, hands already reaching for the wire before he'd finished protesting. "You're fighting it. Wire doesn't respond to being fought. It responds to patience," she demonstrated, quick, economical, the wire going taut and true under fingers that had clearly done this 1,000 times before. "There. Now you try. And stop scowling at it like it insulted your mother." "It didn't insult my mother." "Good. Then you've no excuse." Behind them, Ida laughed, a short, surprised sound, like it had gotten loose before she'd decided whether to let it. Garrett glanced over and caught her trying to smother it against the back of her hand, sable propped on her hip, gumming at a wooden spoon like it held the secrets of the universe. "Something funny?" "No, sir." Ida's mouth twitched, betraying her. "Nothing at all. She's laughing because you look like a man arguing with a woman half his size and losing," Adeline said, passing by with an armload of drying herbs, not even slowing down to deliver the observation. "I am not losing." "You very much are," Senna said, from up on the barn roof where she'd been patching shingles since sunup, not bothering to look down. "I can see it from here." Garrett looked up at her, one hand shading his eyes against the sun. "You've got a lot of opinions for a woman balanced on a roof. Balance is easy." She set another shingle with 2 efficient strikes of the hammer. "It's men who make everything so complicated." He realized absolutely no answer to that, which seemed to be the point. By the second week, the ranch had taken on a rhythm none of them had planned, but all of them seemed to recognize anyway. Agatha running the household like a small benevolent nation, Ida coaxing the last of the season's beans and squash out of ground that had no business, still producing this late in October. Adeline bent over a ledger book at the kitchen table, most evenings with a concentration that would have shamed most bank clerks Garrett had ever dealt with, and Senna everywhere at once, mending patrolling, watching the tree line out of habit even when nothing in it moved. Garrett found himself more than once simply standing still in the middle of it all, coffee cooling in his hand, watching a house that had been dead 6 weeks ago breathe like something alive. It unsettled him a little, how much he liked it. In the evenings, once the work was done and the light had gone soft and orange through the windows, Agatha would sometimes sit down with Sable propped on her knee and sing, low, in a language Garrett didn't understand a word of, and didn't need to, in order to feel the shape of it something old, something that had survived schools and soldiers, and every attempt anybody had ever made to burn it out of the people who carried it. "What's that one about?" he asked, one such evening, when curiosity finally got the better of him. "A river," Agatha said, "and a woman who refuses to stop walking toward it, no matter how many times the world tells her to turn back." She smiled faint private. It seemed appropriate. Sable, entirely unmoved by the historical weight of the moment, reached up and grabbed a fistful of Garrett's shirt where he'd crouched down beside them, and held on with the fierce, unreasoning grip only very small children manage, and would not let go. She's decided she likes you, Ida amused, watching from across the room. God help her judgment, then. Babies, Agatha said, have better judgment about people than most grown men I've known. I wouldn't argue with her if I were you. Garrett let the small fist keep its hold on his shirt a while longer than strictly necessary, and told himself it was only politeness. He didn't quite believe it, but he let himself have the lie anyway, just for that one quiet hour, because some lies he was coming to understand cost a man less than the truth sitting underneath them. He rode into town 2 days later. The settlement wasn't much a scatter of clapboard buildings leaning into each other along one rutted street, a livery, a saloon that opened its doors too early and closed them too late, a general store with a bell over the door that announced every customer whether they wanted announcing or not. Garrett tied his horse and went in for wire nails, and whatever seed the store still had left this late in the season, the bell rang. Heads turned. That was the way of small towns. A new face got read like a page in a book everybody already thought they'd finished. "Holt," said the man behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. "Heard you bought the old Kessler place." "That's right." "Heard something else, too." The storekeeper's eyes flicked toward the door and back, the look of a man about to say something he'd rather somebody else had said first. "Heard you got yourself some unexpected company out there." Garrett kept his face even. News travels fast for a town this size. News about squatters always does. The man said the word like it tasted sour going down. "Especially when the squatters are." He stopped himself, didn't finish it. Didn't need to. "They're not squatters," Garrett said. "They're tenants. Working the land." The storekeeper raised his eyebrows, said nothing further, and rang up the order with the silence of a man who'd decided arguing with a customer wasn't worth the trouble it had cost him. A woman near the flour barrels had been listening the whole time, and didn't bother pretending otherwise. Once Garrett turned to leave. "You'll want to be careful, Mr. Holt," she said. Prim, pleased with herself in the way people get when they mistake cruelty for concern. "Letting Indian women make themselves at home on your property. Folks talk. Folks are welcome to. It isn't proper. A man alone out there with." She stopped short of finishing the sentence, letting the silence do the ugly work her mouth had decided against. Garrett looked at her a long moment, long enough that her chin came up, defensive, like she expected him to apologize for making her say it out loud in the first place. "Ma'am," he said, "even one of those women taught school for 30 years. One of them buried a husband the army wouldn't so much as write a decent letter about. One of them's raising a daughter alone because a man decided her baby's face was reason enough to throw her out in the cold." He picked up his crate of supplies. "I'd think twice before deciding which of us in this conversation has the manners to be worried about." He left her standing there, mouth slightly open, and didn't look back to see how she took it. Outside, tying his purchases to the saddle, Garrett heard his name again this time, from a broad-shouldered man in a tin star crossing the street toward him, with the unhurried gait of somebody who never felt the need to walk faster than the situation required. "Mr." The man extended a hand. "Deacon Rourke. Sheriff, such as the job amounts to out here." Garrett shook it. The grip was firm. The eyes above it were harder to read, not unfriendly exactly, just careful, like a man who'd learned the value of giving away as little as possible. "Sheriff. Word is you've taken in some boarders. Word travels fast. It's a small territory." Rourke's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I'd be careful who you let get comfortable out there if I were you. Man named Voss holds paper on half this county. He's not fond of surprises on land he used to call his." Something in Garrett went very still. "You know Cormac Voss." "Everybody knows Cormac Voss." Rourke said it flat, careful, a man picking his way across ice he wasn't certain would hold. "Man supplies 3 forts in this territory. Owns most of the land office's good favor, besides. If I were you, I'd think twice about giving him a reason to come calling." "Is that a warning, Sheriff, or a threat?" Rourke held his gaze a beat longer than comfortable. "Take it however serves you best, Mr. Holt." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day." He walked off down the street without waiting for a reply, and Garrett stood there a moment, turning the exchange over, trying to decide whether he'd just been cautioned by an honest man, or measured by a man already counting which way a fight was likely to break. He found Otis Pratt outside the livery, doing the kind of work a man does when he wants to be noticed, doing it mending a bridle with quick, competent hands, glancing up just often enough to catch a passing eye. "You hiring, mister?" Pratt asked, before Garrett had even slowed his horse. "Heard you took on the old Kessler spread. Big job for one man." "Might be," Garrett said. "Depends what you're worth with a post-hole digger." Pratt grinned, easy likable. "Worth plenty. Worked 3 ranches south of here before the winters got thin and the wages got thinner." He was maybe 30, sun-browned, quick with his hands and quicker with his smile, the kind of drifter every territory produced by the wagon load. Men without root or grudge, moving from spread to spread, on the strength of a strong back and an empty past, nobody bothered asking too many questions about. "Fence work," Garrett said. "Starting this week. $1 a day and your meals. Done." Pratt spat in his palm and offered the handshake, and Garrett took it, because that was how business got done out here, and because there was nothing in the man's face that gave him any particular reason not to. Nothing, except one small thing that snagged, briefly, and then let go before Garrett thought to hold on to it. "That Kessler place," Pratt said, almost tying off the bridle. "Runs along Cutback Creek, don't it? Heard there's some good bottomland down that draw." "Some," Garrett said. "Why do you ask?" Pratt shrugged, easy as anything. "No reason. Just like knowing the lay of a place before I put my back into it. It was nothing. A man asking about the land he was about to work on. Perfectly reasonable." Garrett rode out of town that afternoon, and didn't think about it again for 2 more days. He should have. Otis Pratt showed up at Copperline 3 mornings later, riding a borrowed mule, and whistling something tuneless and cheerful, and set to work on the north fence without needing to be told twice how a post-hole digger worked. He was, Garrett had to admit, a genuinely good hand, fast, careful with the wire, the kind of worker who made the day go easier just by being competent at it, which counted for a great deal on a ranch that couldn't afford wasted effort. "Ma'am," Pratt said, tipping his hat when Ida brought the noon meal out to the fence line, sable balanced on her hip. "Mr. Pratt. Fine-looking baby you've got there." He said it easy, friendly, the kind of comment any decent man might make. "Takes after her mother, I'd guess." Ida's smile went thin and careful. "She takes after herself, mostly." "Suppose that's the best any of us can hope for." Pratt went back to his wire, whistling again, and if there was anything underneath the comment beyond ordinary friendliness, Ida couldn't have said what it was, and didn't spend much time wondering. Garrett, watching from a little farther down the fence line, found nothing in the exchange worth remarking on either. A friendly man. An easy comment. Nothing more. It would be some while, yet before he learned to weigh Otis Pratt's friendliness against the station he always seemed to know exactly which direction a conversation ought to wander in order to learn something useful without ever once looking like he was asking for it. 40 miles east, in that same week, Sheriff Deacon Rourke sat alone in his office with a letter from the Territorial Bank spread open on the desk in front of him, and did not touch his coffee until it had gone entirely cold. His brother's debt, Voss's bank, in every way that mattered. The numbers hadn't changed since the last time he'd read them, and reading them again didn't make the arithmetic any kinder. He'd told himself, the day he first agreed to look the other way on one of Voss's shipments, that it was a single favor. Small. The kind of thing a man does once and never has to think about again. He'd been wrong about that, the way a man is always wrong about the first domino, right up until the moment he's standing in the middle of all the ones that came crashing after it. Rourke folded the letter, put it away in the drawer where he kept the others, and told himself, the way he told himself most evenings lately, that there would come a day when the ledger balanced back the other way. He did not, yet, believe it, but he kept the thought anyway, filed it alongside the letters, because a man needs somewhere to put the parts of himself he hasn't yet found the courage to spend. He and Senna rode the boundary line together that same week, checking fence posts, marking which ones needed resetting before the ground hardened for winter. It was slow work, methodical, and Senna did most of it without speaking, which suited them both fine, or at least it did for the first hour. "You don't talk much," he said eventually, mostly to fill the quiet. "I talk when there's something worth saying." "That's a fair amount of silence, then. You'd be surprised how little most men manage to say worth hearing." She checked a post, found it solid, moved on without comment. "You're better than most. So far. High praise. Don't get comfortable with it." He almost smiled. rode a while longer before he asked the question that had been sitting in him since the first night. Why'd you stay with them? Agatha, Ida, Adeline. You could have gone anywhere, scouted for another fort. You've got the skill for it. Senna was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer at all. I scouted 11 years, she said finally. Watched men I respected get killed for doing the right thing, and men I didn't respect get promoted for looking the other way. I got tired of being useful to people who'd forget my name the moment I stopped being convenient. She glanced at him, sidelong, measuring. Agatha doesn't forget names. Neither does Adeline. That's worth more to me than another fort's wages. And me? Do I forget names? Ask me again in a month. But there was something almost like humor in it. Dry and quick, gone as soon as it arrived. You haven't given me a reason to remember yours particularly kindly yet. Or unkindly. You're still just a man with a deed and a temper he hasn't fully decided what to do with. That's fair. I know it is. I said it. They rode on a while in a silence that felt different than the one before it, not empty anymore, but companionable. The kind two people share when they've stopped bracing quite so hard against each other. They were coming up along Cutback Creek, the same stretch Pratt had asked about, though Garrett didn't make the connection. At the time when Senna pulled her horse up short. Somebody's been here. Garrett looked around, saw nothing but scrub oak and creekstone, and the low autumn light slanting gold across the water. How do you know that? She pointed. A cluster of thin wooden stakes, driven into the creek bank at careful intervals, each one tied off with a strip of red cloth. Those weren't here last week. Garrett dismounted, crouched beside the nearest one. It was a survey stake, fresh cut. Somebody had been out here measuring, marking, taking note of exactly where the creek bent, and how far the water ran before it disappeared underground through the rock shelf half a mile on. Could be nothing, he said, without much conviction. Land Office does surveys sometimes. Land Office doesn't survey a man's creek without telling him first. Senna's eyes tracked the line of stakes downstream, calculating. Somebody wanted this done quiet. Garrett stood, brushing dust from his knees, and looked out over the water a long moment. The same creek that ran the whole eastern edge of his property. The same stretch of bottomland a friendly, easy sling drifter had asked about. Idle as you please, not 3 days before. He didn't have the shape of it yet. Not fully. But something in his gut had already started arranging the pieces into a picture he didn't like. Pull them, he said. All of them? Every last one. And don't say anything to the others yet. Not until I know what I'm looking at. Senna held his gaze a moment, then nodded, and bent to the work without another word. And Garrett found himself grateful, not for the first time that week, that the woman standing beside him had spent a lifetime learning to notice exactly the things most people rode straight past. 40 miles east, in an office that smelled of cedar and expensive tobacco, Cormac Voss studied a hand-drawn map spread across his desk, and did not look pleased. You said the creek was clear, he said, without looking up. The man standing across from him shifted his weight. It was, Mr. Voss. Nobody living out there but the new owner. Cavalryman bought it clean quick, never asked why it went so cheap. And now? Now he's got company. Voss set down his pen. Slow, deliberate. The stillness of a man who had built his entire fortune on the principle that panic was for people who hadn't planned far enough ahead. What kind of company? Women mostly. 4 of them. One's got a baby. The man hesitated. One of them used to scout for the cavalry out of Fort Kestrel. Something in Voss's face went carefully, dangerously blank. Does she have a name? Didn't get it, sir. Voss stood. Walked to the window. Looked out over land he no longer owned but had never, in any meaningful sense, stopped considering his. He'd sold that ranch fast for a reason. Sold it cheap for the same one. A tired cavalryman with a guilty conscience and a taste for solitude had seemed at the time like precisely the sort of buyer who'd keep his head down, mind his fences, and never once think to wonder why a parcel of land with that much good bottomland along Cutback Creek had gone for less than half of what any honest appraiser would have put on it. He had not accounted for company, especially not the kind of company that had once stood close enough to a certain saddle girth to have opinions about how, exactly, it had come to fail. Finish the survey, Voss said, quietly. I want to know exactly how far that vein runs before winter closes the ground. And the women, sir? Voss turned from the window. His voice when it came was mild, almost pleasant, which was, anyone who'd done business with him could have said, always the moment to be most afraid of him. Find out who they are, he said. All of them. Every name. Every reason they've got for being exactly where they are. He picked his pen back up, unhurried, and returned his attention to the map, like the conversation had already ended. A man doesn't lose a fortune to 4 women and a baby, Mr. Kettering. He simply hasn't yet worked out which lever moves them. Kettering nodded and let himself out, and Cormac Voss sat alone in his cedar-scented office and traced one finger slowly along the blue line of Cutback Creek, from the eastern boundary of a ranch that used to be his, down to the rock shelf where, according to the assayer's report, he'd paid a great deal of money to keep quiet. The water ran clean and cold directly over a vein of silver, rich enough to make every other secret he was protecting feel, by comparison, almost beside the point. Almost. The following afternoon, Senna gathered them all in the yard behind the barn, out of sight of the road, and set 4 bottles up along the top rail of the corral fence. "If Voss knows we're here," she said, "then Voss's men will come before Voss does. That's how men like him work. Send somebody else to test the water first." She checked the chamber of an old rifle. Garrett hadn't known the house possessed until that moment, which means every one of us needs to know which end of a gun does the damage. "I know how to shoot," Adeline said, a little stiff, like the suggestion she might not have offended her on principle. Knowing and doing it steady, with your hands shaking and somebody shouting at you, are 2 different educations. Senna held the rifle out to her anyway. "Show me." Adeline took it, sighted down the barrel, with the careful, correct form of somebody who'd learned properly once, a long time ago, and hadn't had much cause to practice since. She fired. The bottle exploded in a bright scatter of glass, and something in her shoulders loosened that hadn't been loose a moment before. "Marcus taught me," she said quiet, almost to herself. "Said a soldier's wife ought to know how to defend the home he wasn't always there to defend." "He sounds like he had sense," Senna said. "He did." A small, sad smile. More than the men who killed him gave him credit for. Ida went next, awkward at first, flinching before the shot instead of after, until Agatha, of all people, stepped in and adjusted her grip with the brisk, no-nonsense authority of a woman who'd spent 30 years correcting posture at a chalkboard and saw no particular reason a rifle stock should be any different. "Elbow down. Breathe out, not in, right before you pull." Agatha's voice was patient in a way Garrett hadn't heard from her yet. "There, try again." The second shot clipped the bottle, instead of missing it clean by a foot, and Ida laughed, startled, delighted, the sound of somebody surprising herself. Garrett watched from the fence rail, arms crossed, saying nothing, and found himself thinking that he had ridden into this valley 6 weeks ago, planning to build something small and quiet and entirely alone. Instead, he was standing in a yard at dusk, watching 4 women teach each other to hold their ground, and he could not, for the life of him, remember the last time anything had felt quite so much like it was worth defending. "Your turn," Senna said, turning to him, holding out the rifle. "I know how to shoot, I've no doubt." Something almost like a challenge in her eyes. "Show me anyway." He took the rifle, sighted, fired. The bottle shattered clean, and when he lowered the weapon, Senna was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place, not quite approval, not quite anything else either. Just attention. Full and unhurried, the kind she didn't seem to spend on very many things. "Not bad," she said, "for a cavalryman. High praise." "Don't get comfortable with it," she said again. And this time he was fairly certain, though he couldn't have proven it in court, that she was almost smiling when she said it. That evening, the fire built high against the first real bite of the season. Garrett told them what the sheriff had said. Left out the stakes. For now that particular worry could wait until he'd earned the right to say something useful about it. "Rourke," Adeline repeated when he said the name. Something crossed her face, quick and gone. "I remember him. He came to the fort the week after Marcus died. Asked questions. Wrote nothing down that I ever saw. You think he's Voss's man?" "I think," Adeline said carefully, "that he's a man who's decided which way the wind blows in this county and has arranged his conscience accordingly." Agatha shook her head slowly, staring into the fire. "That's most men. In my experience, it's the rare one who will stand against the wind on principle alone." "You sound like you're still teaching a lesson nobody asked to hear," Garrett said, not unkindly. "Old habits." She almost smiled. "Do you know what I miss most, Mr. Holt? Not the schoolhouse. Not even the wages, though the good Lord knows we could use them. I miss watching a child understand something for the first time. That exact moment their face changes." She looked toward the hallway, toward the room where Sable slept. "I think someday When all of this is settled, and it will settle, one way or another, I'd like to teach again. Out here. Properly this time. Both languages. No apology required for either one. Nobody's stopping you from starting now, Garrett said. Agatha looked at him, surprised, like the thought genuinely hadn't occurred to her as something within reach. There's no schoolhouse. There's a barn loft that doesn't leak anymore, thanks to your own hands. There's 4 grown women and a rancher who never did learn his letters as well as he ought to have. He shrugged, plain. Seems to me a teacher doesn't need much more than that to start. Something moved across Agatha's face quick, unguarded, the expression of a woman who'd spent so long being told what she wasn't allowed to want that she'd half forgotten how it felt to be handed permission instead. I'll think on it, she said, which from Agatha, Garrett was already learning meant yes, delivered at a pace that let her keep her dignity intact around the edges of it. Sable fussed once, briefly, and Ida rose to settle her, humming low wordless, a melody that sounded older than any of them in the room. Adeline reached into the collar of her dress and drew out a thin gold ring on a length of cord, worn smooth from years against her skin. This was Marcus's, she said, turning it slowly in the firelight. They wouldn't give me his effects when they discharged me from the fort. Said everything belonged to the army now. I took this before they thought to stop me. She closed her fist around it. It's not evidence. It won't hang anybody in a courtroom. But it's the only piece of him I've got left, and some nights it's the only reason I remember why any of this is worth the fighting. Nobody spoke for a moment. We'll get you more than a ring, Adeline, Garrett said finally. I don't know how yet, but I mean to. She looked at him, searching, the way a person looks at somebody deciding whether their word is worth banking a future on. You barely know us, Mr. Holt. I know. Enough. Enough. He held her gaze steady. I know a good man is dead because he tried to do the honest thing in a territory that doesn't reward it. I know 4 women built a home out of nothing, rather than lie down and let the world finish what it started. That's more than most men manage to know about their own neighbors in a lifetime. Agatha watched him with the careful warmth of a teacher recognizing, against her own better caution, a student finally worth the effort. Careful, Mr. Holt, she said softly. Say things like that often enough, and we might start believing you mean them. I do mean them. Then say them again in a month, Senna said. From her spot by the door, arms crossed, eyes on the dark beyond the window where the road wound off toward a town, and a sheriff, and a man named Cormac Voss who did not yet know how badly he'd underestimated what he'd sold away. Words are easy by firelight. Let's see what they're worth once trouble actually finds this door. Garrett sat with his coffee going cold in his hand, and thought about a man he'd never met face-to-face longer than the time it took to sign. Indeed, a man who'd sold him a ranch cheap and fast and clean, who held the fear of half a county in his back pocket, and who did not yet know that the one witness capable of hanging him for murder was at this very moment sits 6 feet from Garrett's own front door. That knowledge wouldn't stay buried forever. Somebody was already out at the creek with stakes and red cloth, measuring something Garrett didn't understand yet. Somebody had asked careful, idle questions about the very same stretch of water, 3 days before those stakes went into the ground. And somewhere between the two of those facts sat an answer. Garrett hadn't found yet one he was beginning to suspect had less to do with old sins buried at the bottom of a supply ledger, and a great deal more to do with something Cormac Voss wanted back. He looked around the room. At Agatha, steady as a keel. At Ida, humming her daughter back to sleep. At Adeline, dry-eyed and burning. At Senna, watching the door the way she watched everything like it might, at any moment, prove her right about the world all over again. 5 people now bound together by one bad man's greed, whether any of them had chosen it or not. Garrett didn't know yet what Voss was really after. But he knew, with the same cold certainty that had put his hand on his holster the moment he first saw rising over a ranch that should have stood empty, that whatever it was, the man wasn't finished. Coming for it. Not by a long way. They came on a Tuesday. Garrett would remember that detail long after he'd forgotten most of what got said. The way a man remembers the small useless facts standing right next to the moment his whole life turned a corner. Tuesday. Overcast. The kind of gray sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain, and so simply hung there, undecided the whole long morning. He heard the horses before he saw them. 5, maybe 6. Coming up the road at an unhurried walk, the unhurried walk of men who already believe the ground under them belongs to somebody who isn't in a hurry either. Garrett had spent enough years learning to read a column of riders from a distance that he didn't need to count them twice. 5 was a number a man brought when he wanted to be heard. 15 was a number a man brought when he'd already decided talking was finished. 5 this morning still left room for words. He intended to make the most of that room while it lasted. Company Senna said, appearing at his shoulder like she'd grown there. I heard you should get the rifle. I've got the rifle. Get the other one too. He got the other one too. By the time the riders crested the last rise into the yard, the whole household had gathered on the porch, without a word passed between them to arrange it. Agatha in front with her chin up. Ida a step behind with Sable pressed close against her chest. Adeline pale and straight-backed by the rail. Senna at Garrett's shoulder with her hand resting, easy, deliberate, on the rifle stock. The lead rider dismounted first. Tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who has never once in his adult life had to carry his own water. Silver at his temples. A face weathered smooth by sun and years of getting exactly what he wanted, and not one single crease in it that suggested he'd ever spent a night wondering whether he deserved to. Cormac Voss. He took his time crossing the yard. No hurry in it. A man who did not need to hurry, because the world had never once made him. Behind him came 2 hired men Garrett didn't recognize and didn't much want to. And behind them, hanging back at the edge of things like a man who'd rather be anywhere else, Sheriff Deacon Rourke, his hat brim pulled low, his eyes on the ground more often than on the porch. Mr. Holt Voss's voice was deep, carrying. The voice of a man used to rooms going quiet the moment he opened his mouth in them. I understand you've taken in some house guests. I understand you've ridden 30 miles to ask me about it. Something flickered behind Voss's eyes. Amusement, maybe. Or the irritation of a man unused to being answered, instead of deferred to. These women are trespassing on your property. Mr. Holt, he said it plain, reasonable. The way a man recites a fact he's certain nobody in earshot will bother disputing. Apache women. No papers. No standing under territorial law to be here at all. I'd suggest you remove them before this becomes a legal matter neither of us enjoys. This is my land, Garrett said. I decide who stands on it. You don't understand the situation. Then explain it to me. Under territorial statute, Voss said, each word laid down slow and deliberate, like a man setting cards on a table he already knew he'd win. Unmarried Apache women without documented employment or sponsorship are subject to removal. I'd hate to see you fined for harboring them, Mr. Holt. Or worse. Worse. These are unsettled times. Voss's gaze drifted, unhurried, past Garrett's shoulder to the porch beyond. Accidents happen to men who make themselves inconvenient. I'd know. I've buried 3 good employees to bad luck this year alone. The words landed soft, almost pleasant, and that, Garrett understood immediately, was precisely the point of saying them that way, a threat dressed up as small talk, deniable the moment anybody thought to repeat it back to him in a courtroom. That sounds, Garrett said, like a confession dressed up as a warning. It sounds, Voss said, like a man being neighborly. You're new to this territory, Mr. Holt. I'd hate for you to learn its harder lessons the hard way, on account of poor company. Voss's gaze, unhurried, across the porch Agatha Adeline, and finally Senna, where it stopped, and stayed, a half-second too long to be accidental. Senna's voice cut across the yard, calm, clear before Garrett could answer for her. I'm not uninvited and I'm not unaccounted for. She didn't move from Garrett's shoulder. I know exactly who you are, Mr. Voss. I scouted for the cavalry out of Fort Kestrel. I was there the morning. They pulled Lieutenant Marcus Voss out of the mud with his neck broken and his saddle girth cut clean through. The yard went very still. Voss, a face, didn't change. That, Garrett would think later, was the worst part of it, how little it cost the man to hear that sentence and give nothing at all. That's a serious accusation, Voss said, mild. Pleasant. The pleasantness that anyone who'd done business with him could have told you was always the moment to be most afraid of him. Made by a woman with no standing to bring it before any court in this territory. Standing's a funny thing, Senna said. It has a way of showing up right when a man least wants it to. Voss's eyes narrowed, just slightly. Recalculating, Sheriff. He didn't turn to look at Rourke, didn't need to. Perhaps you'd care to remind Mr. Holt what happens to a man who harbors known agitators on his property. Rourke shifted in his saddle. Looked, for one unguarded second, like a man being asked to swallow something with sharp edges. Mr. Holt, he said, careful. I'd advise caution. That's all. Nothing more. That's it? Voss's voice sharpened. That's your advice? It's my advice, Mr. Voss. Rourke met his eyes for the first time since riding into the yard. I can't arrest a man for feeding his own hired hands. Something passed across Voss's face, then quick, cold, gone almost before it arrived, filed away. The look of a man adjusting a ledger, somewhere in his head, noting a debt he intended to collect later, on his own schedule, in his own very well. He turned back to Garrett and smiled, and the smile had absolutely nothing warm anywhere inside it. You're making a mistake, Mr. Holt. I sold you a fair piece of land at a fair price. I'd hate to see that generosity turn sour over a misunderstanding. Funny, Garrett said. I don't recall you mentioning a dead lieutenant when we signed the papers. The smile stayed exactly where it was. That was the thing Garrett noticed most. Replaying it later, how completely the man's face refused to give him anything to work with. I don't know what you're referring to. I think you do. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Behind Voss, one of the hired men shifted his weight, hand drifting a half-inch closer to his holster, and Senna's rifle came up half an inch to match it, and the whole yard seemed to hold its breath at once, waiting to see which way the next second was going to break. Then Voss laughed. Short, humorless. You'll want to think carefully about who you've decided to believe, Mr. Holt. He turned toward his horse. Territory's a small place. Word travels. And men who make enemies of me generally find that word travels a great deal faster than they'd like. He mounted, unhurried. Same as always. Good day, he said, to the yard in general, and rode off without waiting for anybody to return the sentiment, his two hired men falling in behind him. Rourke lingered a moment longer, looked at Garrett, looked, briefly, at Adeline, something passing behind his eyes, that might have been guilt, might have been nothing at all. Be careful, he said, quiet, and then he too was gone, and the yard was empty again except for 5 people and a baby standing very still in the gray, undecided light. Nobody spoke until the sound of hooves had faded entirely into the flat distance. He knows, Adeline said finally. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to keep it that way. Garrett could see the cost in the white line of her knuckles on the porch rail. He suspected, Senna corrected. Now he knows for certain. There's a difference, and it isn't a good one for us. Ida sank slowly onto the porch step. Sable held tight against her, and for a moment nobody moved to comfort her, because for a moment nobody trusted their own voice enough to try. I keep thinking, she said, quiet, almost to herself, that a man like that shouldn't be allowed to just ride up, say what he said. Ride away, again, like he's done nothing at all. She looked up, and her eyes were dry, but only barely. How does the world let a man do that? It doesn't let him, Agatha said. It just hasn't stopped him yet. Those aren't the same thing, whatever they might feel like from where you're sitting. They feel exactly the same from where I'm sitting. I know. Agatha crouched slow, her knees protesting the movement, and put a steadying hand on Ida's shoulder. That's the cruelest part of waiting on justice, child. It asks you to hold the difference in your own 2 hands, all by yourself, for as long as it takes the rest of the world to catch up to what you already know is true. What do we do? Ida's voice had gone very small. Sable, sensing the shift in the air the way infants always seem to, began to fuss softly against her shoulder. Agatha was the one who answered, and when she did, her voice had the flat calm of a woman who had already, somewhere in the last 5 minutes, done the arithmetic. The rest of them were only starting on. We stop waiting for the law to find us, she said. We go find it first. There's a circuit judge, Adeline said slowly, like the thought was arriving even as she spoke it. Judge Corwin Ashby. He rides the territorial circuit twice a year. Marcus mentioned him once, said he was one of the few men on the bench who couldn't be bought outright, though God knows plenty had tried. Where? Larkspur. 3 days, ride. If the schedule's held, he's sitting circuit court there through the end of the week. Garrett looked at the road where Voss's dust was still hanging faint in the gray air. 3 days there, he said. A day, maybe 2, to be heard. 3 days back, that's the better part of a week we'd be gone. A week is a long time, Agatha said, for a man like that to decide what he wants to do about us. I know it. Then we don't have a great many good options, do we? There's another matter, Adeline said quietly, before anybody could move past the thought. Judge Ashby will want more than my word or Senna's. Marcus kept records of his own, a private ledger, separate from the official supply books, where he wrote down every discrepancy as he found it. Dates, amounts, which shipments were shorted and by how much. Her hands twisted together, restless. I don't know if it survived. When they cleared me out of officer housing, I had an hour to pack. I wasn't thinking about ledgers. I was thinking about getting out with my life. Where would it be now? Senna asked. If it wasn't burned, if some clerk quietly filed it, instead of destroying it, it would still be at the fort, with his effects or hidden somewhere nobody thought to look. Adeline shook her head slowly. I have no way of knowing which. Then that's a second door to knock on, Garrett said, once the first one's open. One thing at a time, Agatha said, in the tone of a woman closing a lesson before her students wandered too far ahead of it. The judge first. Whatever comes after comes after. Nobody argued with that. Garrett looked around the yard at Agatha's steadiness, at Ida's fear folding itself carefully around the baby in her arms, at Adeline's grief burning low and controlled, at Senna, already watching the road like it might yet cough up something worse than what had already ridden down it. I'll go, Garrett said. Senna knows the country better than I do, and she's the one with the testimony that matters most. The rest of you stay. Lock the doors. Keep the guns loaded and close. If anybody comes, we know what to do, Agatha said, gentle, but firm enough to close the subject. We've done this before, Mr. Holt. Longer than you've known us. I then trust it. He looked at her a long moment. At all of them, he said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it was entirely true. He found Ida in the kitchen a little later, Sable propped on her hip, and stood in the doorway a moment before either of them noticed him there. You're leaving in the morning, Ida said. Not quite a question. First light. She was quiet a moment, jostled Sable gently, the baby's small fist working its way, once again, into a fistful of somebody's shirt, Ida's, this time patient and unbothered, entirely, unaware of the weight sitting in the room around her. I keep thinking about the last man who told me he'd keep us safe, Ida said, quiet, not looking at him directly. He meant it too, I think, for a while. Garrett didn't flinch from that, though it cost him something, not to. I'm not him. I know that. I do. She looked up, finally, and there was more steel in her than he'd credited her with. That first frightened night, he'd found her guarding a crib with her whole body. I just need you to understand what it costs a person, trusting a man's word again, after the last one turned out hollow. I'm doing it anyway. I want you to know that's not nothing, coming from me. It isn't nothing, Garrett agreed. I won't waste it. Sable made a small, contented sound against her mother's shoulder, entirely oblivious, and something in Garrett's chest ached at the sight of her small, trusting, asleep against the one person in the world who'd fought hardest to keep her that way. Take care of her, he said, nodding at the baby, and let Agatha and Senna take care of you while I'm gone. That's not weakness, letting people hold you up. It's the whole reason any of us are still standing at all. Ida managed a small, tired smile. You've gotten wise all of a sudden, Mr. Holt. Borrowed wisdom. Most of it's Agatha's. I'm just repeating it back convincingly. That at least pulled a real laugh out of her brief, quiet but real, and Garrett carried the sound of it with him out into the cold night air, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it steadied something in his chest that had been unsteady since the moment Voss's dust first rose on the road that morning. At that night, after the others had gone to bed and the fire had burned down to a low orange breath in the hearth, Garrett found Otis Pratt still awake by the barn, seated on an overturned crate, working a whetstone slow and unhurried along the edge of a knife that didn't, so far as Garrett had ever seen, get much use in the ordinary run of fence work. Can't sleep? Garrett asked. Pratt looked up, easy smile already in place, quick as always. Never could. The night before a man's expected to do something useful. Heard you're riding out. Word travels fast around here, small ranch. Pratt shrugged, went back to the whetstone. Not much a man doesn't hear, sooner or later, if he keeps his ears open. Garrett studied him a moment. Found nothing in the man's face he could put a name to, no tell, no crack, nothing but an easy drifter sharpening a knife by firelight. Same as 100 other easy drifters Garrett had crossed paths with in a dozen other places. Keep an eye on things while I'm gone, Garrett said. Count on it. Mr. Holt. Pratt's smile widened, friendly as ever. I'll take real good care of everything out here. Garrett went to bed that night thinking nothing further of the exchange. He would think of it a great deal later. Every single word of it, turned over and over, looking for the crack he should have seen and hadn't. They left at first light. Agatha stood on the porch to see them off, Ida beside her with Sable still half asleep against her shoulder, Adeline a step behind, and none of them waved. Exactly, it wasn't that kind of departure, but Garrett felt their eyes on his back the entire length of the drive, all the way out to where the road bent around the first stand of juniper, and finally, mercifully took the house out of sight. The sky had cleared overnight into a hard, clean blue, the kind of blue that made the whole desert look freshly made, and for the first hour neither of them said much, letting the horses find their rhythm, the miles peeling away slow and steady beneath a sun that hadn't yet worked up the will to be cruel about it. "You're quiet," Senna observed eventually. "Thinking. About Voss? About a lot of things." He let the silence sit a moment before he added, "About how a man tells 4 women he'll keep them safe, and then rides off in the opposite direction 2 days later. You're not riding away from them," Senna said. "You're riding toward the one thing that might actually help them. There's a difference. Feels the same from where I'm sitting. Most useful things do, right up until they aren't." She looked over at him, something almost gentle in it, which from Senna he was learning, counted for a great deal more than it would have from most people. "You did the right thing, Garrett. Leaving somebody behind who can shoot straight and lock a door isn't the same as abandoning them." It was, he noticed, the first time she'd used his given name instead of the formal weight of Mr. Holt. He didn't remark on it, didn't need to. Something had shifted, small and quiet, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, and neither of them seemed inclined to disturb it by naming it out loud too soon. They rode on. The country opened wide and gold around them, mesquite and scrub and long red rock throwing shadow shark up as knife blades across the trail. "Can I ask you something?" Garrett said, some while later. "You can ask. That saying. The one about a man and his footprints. Where'd you learn it?" Senna was quiet a moment. "My mother," she said finally. "She used to say it about my father. He fought when he was young. Killed men he had every right to hate. And then one day he decided he was done being defined by it, and he spent the rest of his life proving he meant it." Something moved across her face, old grief, worn smooth at the edges by time. "He died believing he'd earned the right to be remembered as more than the worst thing he ever did. Do you believe that? That a man can earn that?" "I didn't used to." She looked at him, steady, unflinching. "I'm reconsidering." Garrett said nothing to that. Didn't trust his voice to manage it cleanly. But something in his chest loosened, just slightly, the way a knot loosens when somebody finally gently works a thumb into the worst of it. They made camp that evening in a shallow draw, no fire, too exposed this close to the main road, and ate cold biscuit and dried meat in a silence that had stopped, somewhere over the course of the day, being uncomfortable. "You've gone somewhere else," Senna said, watching him over the last of the biscuit. "Whole last hour. Where'd you go?" "Nowhere worth talking about." "Try me anyway." Garrett looked at the small dead fire pit they hadn't dared light, at the dark pressing close around the little hollow they'd chosen for the night, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wanted to answer her, honestly, more than he wanted to keep the old habit of not answering at all. "There was a creek," he said finally. "Different one. Different territory. 3 years back." He kept his eyes on the middle distance, the way a man does when he's talking around something rather than at it. "We were chasing people who'd left the reservation, trying to get back to old ground before winter. Wasn't supposed to be a fight. Orders were to bring them in peaceful." Senna didn't say anything, didn't press. Just let the quiet hold the shape he needed it to hold. "It didn't stay peaceful," he said. "I was young. Scared. Though I'd have died before admitting it out loud back then. Somebody fired low. Then everybody was firing." His jaw worked. "I've carried what happened next a long way since. Farther than I know how to put down. You don't have to tell me the rest," Senna said quiet. "Not tonight, maybe not ever, if that's what you need." "I know." He looked at her then. Something in his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with the old wound and everything to do with how much easier it was to breathe, just slightly, with somebody sitting across from him who wasn't demanding the whole confession all at once. "I might tell you the rest of it someday, when I trust myself to say it without it swallowing the both of us." "I'll still be here," Senna said, simply, like it was the plainest fact in the world. And maybe out here, under a sky this wide and indifferent it was. They didn't speak again for a long while. But the silence had a different weight to it now. Not empty, not careful. Just 2 people sharing the same dark, each of them a little less alone in it than they'd been an hour before. Somewhere well past midnight, Garrett woke to the sound of Senna's rifle sliding quietly out from under her blanket, and found her sitting upright, still as stone, staring off toward a low ridge to the south. "What is it?" he whispered. Movement may be nothing. She didn't lower the rifle. Coyotes don't usually walk in a line, though. They sat like that a long while, tense, silent, until whatever it was, coyotes, or something with worse intentions, moved off without ever showing itself clearly enough to name. Neither of them slept much after that. But when dawn finally came up gray and then gold over the ridge, Senna looked over at him, and something passed between them that didn't need any words at all. 2 more days, Senna said, wrapping herself in her blanket, watching the stars come up, hard and bright overhead. 2 more days, Garrett agreed. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that 2 days was a very long time to leave 4 people and an infant alone, with nothing but a locked door and a rifle between them and a man who did not, by every account Garrett had gathered so far, take losing well. Back at the ranch, the first 2 days passed in a strange, watchful quiet, the whole household moving through its chores with one ear turned always toward the road. Agatha kept them busy on purpose. Garrett's absence left a hole in the work that needed filling, and filling it kept hands occupied and minds too tired by evening to spiral too far into worry. They mended and canned, and reset 2 fence posts that had started leaning, and in the evenings, after Sable had finally been coaxed down to sleep, the 3 remaining women sat by the fire together in the closeness that only comes from people who have decided, without ever quite saying so out loud, to be afraid of the same things together rather than alone. "Do you think he'll listen?" Ida asked. One such evening, watching the flames. The judge. "I think men who sit on benches listen to whoever's easiest to believe," Adeline said quiet. "And it's always easier to believe a man with money than 4 women with grief. That's a hard way to think about it. It's an honest way." Adeline turned Marcus's ring over once between her fingers, a habit she'd fallen into without quite noticing she'd started it. "I loved a man who believed the law was a fair thing, if you were patient enough and honest enough to let it work properly. It got him killed believing that." She looked up, and something in her face had softened, just slightly, around the old hard edges of her grief. "I don't know that I believe it the way he did anymore, but I want for his sake, if nothing else." Agatha reached over and took her hand, the same brief, firm gesture she'd once used to steady Ida on the very first night any of them had spent under this roof. "Then we hold on to wanting to," she said. "Sometimes that's the whole of what faith actually is. Not certainty, just the stubbornness to keep wanting the good thing, long after the world's given you every reason to stop." Ida looked between the 2 of them, Agatha's steady, weathered patience, Adeline's grief, slowly softening into something that looked almost like hope, however guarded, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, the shape of a family forming around her, built from nothing but stubbornness and shared fear and the daily decision to keep showing up for one another anyway. "I never had this," she said quietly, growing up. "People who'd just stay, no matter what it cost them." "You have it now," Agatha said, "for as long as any of us have breath left to offer it." Sable stirred faintly in her sleep in the next room, and all 3 of them turned toward the sound out of pure reflex, the way mothers do, whether or not the child in question was born of their own bodies. It was, Ida would think later, the last entirely peaceful evening any of them would have for a long while afterward. She was glad, at least, that she'd let herself enjoy it fully while it lasted, instead of spending it braced for the thing that was already, quietly, riding toward them. Ida saw him first. It was the 3rd night, well past midnight, the household long since settled, the fire banked low, when a small sound outside the window pulled her up out of a thin, uneasy sleep. Sable stirred against her but didn't wake. Ida lay still a moment, listening, telling herself it was nothing, a coyote, the wind finding a gap in the shingles, anything at all that wasn't what her gut had already, quietly, decided it was. Because that was the thing about fear that had once already cost her everything. It didn't ask politely. It just arrived, cold and certain, ahead of any proof a reasonable person would have waited for. Then she heard the barn door. She rose slow, careful, laid Sable in the crib, with a hand pressed light against the small sleeping back until she was certain the baby would stay down, and moved to the window. Otis Pratt was crossing the yard. Not toward the outhouse. Not toward anything a man might reasonably be doing at this hour. He moved low, quick, purposeful, toward the tree line at the edge of the property, where Ida's breath caught in her throat. A second shape was waiting for him, mounted, patient, in the deep shadow under the junipers. She should have woken Agatha. She knew that, even as she was already easing the back door open instead. except some old instinct from a harder life told her that the only way to know for certain, the only way to be believed, if it came to it, was to hear the thing herself, whole, unfiltered, before she went and put a name to it. So she went, silent, every nerve in her body screaming at her to turn around, and every one of them overruled by the small, stubborn certainty that whatever was happening in that tree line concerned her daughter, and she was done letting things happen to the people she loved without at least trying to see them coming first. She got close enough, just barely, crouched low behind the woodpile, heart slamming so loud in her own ears she was half convinced the men across the yard would hear it too. Leave day after tomorrow, if the judge keeps his schedule, Pratt was saying, low, hurried. 2 women and the girl left at the house. Old teacher's got a temper but no real fight in her. Won't be trouble. And the scout. Gone with Holt. That's the whole point, ain't it? Best window Mr. Voss is going to get. The second rider, Ida didn't know his face, only his voice. Flat and businesslike, a man discussing livestock. Not people made a small sound of satisfaction. He'll want it done clean. No fire if it can be helped. Just the 2 women. Leave the girl and the baby be for now. For now. Ida's whole body went cold at the phrase. Cold enough that she barely registered her own hand pressed hard against her mouth to keep the sound of her breathing from carrying. Because for now wasn't mercy. She understood that much instantly, in her bones, the way she'd understood a dozen other cruel arithmetic problems in her short life. For now just meant later. It meant somebody had already decided the question, and simply hadn't gotten around to answering it yet. When? Pratt asked. Tomorrow night, before Holt's back to complicate things. The rider turned his horse and melted off into the dark without another word, and Pratt stood a moment, alone, looking back toward the house, toward the very window Ida had climbed out of not 5 minutes before, and something in his stillness made her blood run colder still, because for just a moment, in the thin moonlight, his face had none of the easy friendliness it wore in daylight, none of it at all. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, whistling soft and tuneless, same as Ove, and Ida stayed frozen behind the woodpile a long, long time before she trusted her legs enough to carry her back inside. She woke Agatha first, then Adeline. Told it all in a whisper that kept threatening to break apart halfway through the telling. Agatha's face, in the low candlelight, went very still. Tomorrow night, she repeated. That's what he said. Then we don't have the luxury of waiting for Garrett, Adeline said, already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead in the way of a woman who had once run a household on an army wage and knew exactly how fast a crisis could outrun its own warning. We barricade what we can. We keep the guns close. And we do not, under any circumstance, let that man back into this house. He'll know something's wrong if we lock him out, Agatha said. Let him know. Adeline's voice had gone flat, hard, entirely unlike the careful composure she usually wore like armor. Let him ride back to Voss and tell him exactly that. I'd rather he know we're ready than walk in here tomorrow night thinking we're not. Ida looked at the crib, at Sable sleeping through all of it, small fists curled, entirely unaware of how close the walls around her had just come to falling in. What about her, she whispered. Agatha crossed the room, put both hands on Ida's shoulders, steady, warm, the grip of a woman who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to hold somebody together when they most needed holding. You take her to the cellar the moment there's trouble, she said. You do not come out. Not for us. Not for anything. Do you understand me? I can't just, and you will. Agatha's eyes did not waver. Somebody has to live to tell Garrett what happened here. It's going to be you. The 3 of them spent the rest of that night by lamplight, moving through the house in grim, deliberate silence, turning the small home into whatever fortress 4 women and 1 infant could manage on a few hours' warning. Adeline checked the rifle 3 times, then a 4th, because her hands would not quite stop shaking long enough to trust the first 3 counts. Agatha wedged the door with a length of fence post, driven in hard at an angle, and tested it with her whole weight until it held. Ida cleared a path to the cellar hatch of everything that might catch a foot or make a sound in the dark, and practiced the route twice, blind eyes shut, Sable's weight imagined against her chest, until she could have walked it in her sleep. If it comes to shooting, Agatha said, low to Adeline, aim for anything that isn't Ida or the baby. And don't stop to ask whether you're doing it right. There isn't time for doing it right. There's only doing it. I know. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. Because saying it steadies me more than it steadies you, probably. And tonight I'll take whatever steadiness I can get." Adeline almost smiled at that, a small, tired, genuine thing, entirely out of place, given the hour and the fear sitting heavy in the room, and somehow all the more real for it. "We've survived worse nights than this one," she said. "Both of us." "We have." Agatha's hand found hers, brief, firm. "Let's see to it we survive this one too." They banked the fire low, doused every lamp but one, and sat up together in the dark, waiting, listening to a house that had never once, in all the weeks they'd lived in it, felt quite so much like it was holding its breath alongside them. They came the following night, an hour past midnight, and they came quiet, the way men come when they've been told there's to be no fire, no noise, nothing that might carry to a neighboring spread and bring witnesses down on a job that was supposed to stay clean. Adeline heard the latch first, the one they'd wedged, the one that should have held. It didn't hold. "Ida," she hissed, already moving, already reaching for the rifle prop by the door. "Go, now." No argument, no hesitation. Ida grabbed Sable from the crib, wrapped tight, and was through the back and into the cellar hatch before the front door had finished splintering inward. Agatha's voice behind her, sharp, commanding, buying seconds that mattered more than either of them would ever be able to properly explain afterward. Then the world came apart. 3 men, boots first, then shapes, black against the doorway, and no more time to count them than that. Agatha swung the heavy iron skillet before the first man cleared the threshold, caught him hard across the temple. He dropped like a felled tree and did not get back up, not that night, not for a long while after, and for one wild, hopeful heartbeat it seemed like it might actually be enough. Like maybe 3 had just become 2, and 2 women against 2 men were odds a person could survive. It wasn't enough, because it never is. Because 2 are still 2 more than none, and none was the number Agatha and Adeline actually had standing behind them in that room. Adeline fired once. The shot went wide in the dark and the chaos and the ringing in her own ears. Then a second man was on her, wrenching the rifle from her hands, and she fought, clawed, twisted, drove her elbow back hard enough to feel something in his face give under it, until the third man's fist connected with the side of Agatha's skull, and she went down, and did not get back up, and Adeline's whole world narrowed, in that instant, down to a single screaming certainty. "This is already lost. Stop." Or she thought she said it. Her voice didn't sound like her own anymore, thin and far away, somebody else's terror wearing her mouth. "Stop, please, she's not moving, please." Nobody stopped, because men who've been paid to be quick don't have room left over for mercy. Because mercy costs time, and time was the one thing Cormac Voss had told them, in no uncertain terms, not to spend. They dragged Agatha up by both arms, blood dark and matting in her gray hair, and one of the men laughed an ugly, short bark of a sound and said something to the others. Adeline couldn't make herself hear clean enough to remember later. Then hands were on her too, rough, hauling her toward the door, and the last thing she saw before the night swallowed the both of them was the cellar hatch, latched tight, silent, exactly where it needed to be. Good, she thought, distant, strange, floating somewhere above her own body. Good. They didn't find her. It was the only mercy the whole night managed to offer, and Adeline held on to it, hard, the entire dark ride that followed, because it was the only thing left standing between her and the kind of terror that has no floor underneath it at all. Behind them, in the wreckage of the front room, the man Agatha had struck stirred once, groaned, and went still again, left where he'd fallen, because a man who can't sit a horse is a man not worth the trouble of dragging along, and because whoever gave the orders that night had apparently decided one unconscious witness left behind was an acceptable cost of doing business. It was, though nobody yet knew it, a mistake that would matter a great deal more than the man who made it could have possibly imagined. In the cellar in the dark, Ida pressed her hand flat over Sable's mouth, not hard, never hard, just enough to keep the small, confused whimper from finding its way up through the floorboards, and listen to the sounds above her stop being human sounds at all, and become instead the sounds of horses and boots and a door swinging loose on a broken hinge in a wind that didn't care, one way or the other, what it had just been made to witness. She stayed there long after the hoofbeats had faded into nothing. Stayed there, rocking Sable in the absolute dark, humming without sound, mouthing the words instead of singing them, because some habits don't stop just because the world above them has gone quiet in the worst possible way. She stayed until dawn found the cracks in the cellar door and turned them gray, then gold. And only then did she trust her legs enough to climb back up into a house that no longer looked like the one she'd fallen asleep in 3 nights before. Larkspur turned out to be bigger than Garrett expected. A proper courthouse, brick-faced, sitting square in the middle of a town that had clearly decided, at some point, to take itself seriously. They waited 2 hours on a hard bench outside the judge's chambers, watching a parade of ranch disputes and cattle brand quarrels shuffle in and out ahead of them. And by the time a clerk finally called their names, Garrett's patience had worn thin enough to feel it in his jaw. Judge Corwin Ashby received them in a small side office off the main courtroom, a spare, sharp-eyed man of perhaps 60, who listened to the whole account Senna's testimony about the girth. Adeline's story relayed secondhand, the timeline of the sale, the visit from Voss without once interrupting, and without, Garrett noted with some unease, once changing his expression either. When it was finished, the judge folded his hands on the desk and was quiet a long moment. "That's a serious set of accusations," he said finally. "It's the truth," Senna said. "I don't doubt your sincerity, Miss Calder. I doubt very much whether it's enough." He said it not unkindly, but plainly, the way a man delivers bad weather. A soldier's word unsupported, a widow's grief unsupported, against a man who supplies 3 forts in this territory and sits comfortably with half the land office in his pocket. He shook his head slowly. "I'd be laughed off this bench if I acted on testimony alone. I need paper, ledgers, a witness with something to lose by lying, and something official behind their name when they say it." "So that's it," Garrett said, flat. "He gets to keep killing people because his bookkeeping is tidier than our grief." "I didn't say that." The judge's eyes sharpened. "I said I need more before I can move, and in the meantime, I'd advise caution. Witnesses, a paper trail of your own, if you can manage it, dates, names, anyone else who might have seen what Miss Calder saw." He tapped one finger against the desk, considering. Was there a written record kept by the lieutenant himself? Officers of conscience often keep their own accounts, separate from what the Army wants filed. There may have been, Adeline had told them to say, and Garrett said it now, careful, deliberate. A private ledger. We don't yet know if it survived. Something in the judge's expression shifted. Very slightly, the first real flicker of interest Garrett had seen cross it all afternoon. "If that ledger exists," Ashby said, "and if it can be authenticated as the lieutenant's own hand, that changes matters considerably. That's not a widow's grief, Mr. Holt. That's evidence. Find it. Bring it to me directly, not through the mail, not through anyone who might be persuaded to lose it along the way. I sit this circuit again in 6 weeks. I'll hear it the moment you bring it." 6 weeks is a long time, Garrett said. "It's the soonest I can offer you within the bounds of what the law actually allows me to do." The judge's voice softened fractionally. "I understand your frustration. I've watched men like Voss operate in this territory a long while, Mr. Holt, longer than I care to admit without losing my temper about it. I want him brought down as much as you do, but I want it done in a way that holds, once it's done. A conviction that falls apart on appeal helps nobody. It just teaches men like him that the law is a puddle, easily stepped around. Find me the paper trail. Find me one honest man on his payroll, willing to put his name to something. Bring it to me, and I promise you, Mr. Holt, I will not look away from it." He stood, signaling the meeting's end. "But I will not ruin a man's name or risk my own bench on testimony a defense lawyer could take apart in an afternoon. I'm sorry. That's not justice failing you. That's justice being careful, so it doesn't fail somebody else instead, someday, when the accusation runs the other direction." It was, Garrett thought, riding back out of Larkspur 2 hours later, a perfectly reasonable answer. It didn't make it feel any less like a door closing. "You're grinding your jaw," Senna observed, once the town had shrunk small behind them. "Am I? Like you're trying to bite through a fence post." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead, giving him the courtesy of not making him hold her gaze, while he worked through whatever was sitting so heavy in him. He didn't say no. He said not yet. Feels a great deal like no, wearing a patient man's voice. Feels like it. Isn't the same thing. She glanced over. "Finally, you wanted him to just believe us. Wave a hand, arrest Voss on the spot. Hand you back 4 weeks of peace and quiet. That was never going to happen, Garrett. Not for us. Not for anybody without money enough to make believing easy. So what was the point of riding out here at all?" "The point," Senna said, Patient in the way that comes from having explained hard truths to frightened people more times than she cared to count, is that now there's a judge on record who's heard the accusation and is waiting on the proof. That's not nothing. That's a door left open a crack instead of shut entirely. She paused. We just have to be the ones who kick it the rest of the way. Garrett was quiet a long moment, turning that over, letting the anger in him cool down into something more useful. You're better at this than I am, he said finally. The patience part. I've had more practice. Something moved behind her eyes, brief old. Impatience gets Apache people killed a great deal faster than it gets them justice. I learned that lesson early, and I learned it the hard way, same as most lessons worth keeping. He didn't have an answer for that. Just rode alongside her a while, the two of them quiet, the desert wide and gold and indifferent around them, and found, somewhere in that shared silence, a little more of the anger draining out of him than talking alone would ever have managed. They were 2 days out on the return trail when Senna reined up sharp, scanning the horizon with an expression Garrett had learned over the past week to take seriously without question. What is it? Ryder. Coming hard. She squinted against the glare. Alone. It was a boy, no older than 14, from a spread a few miles east of Copperline, and he nearly fell off his horse getting the words out. Mr. Holt, there's been trouble out at your place. 2 nights back. My pa saw riders on the road, heard it from a fella passing through this morning. Garrett's whole chest went cold before the boy had finished the sentence. What kind of trouble? Don't rightly know, sir. Just that somebody hit your ranch hard, and there weren't nobody left standing outside to say different. Garrett was already moving before the boy finished talking, already turning his horse, already feeling the entire careful, hopeful shape of the last 3 days collapse into something with teeth in it. Garrett Senna's voice, sharp, cutting through the roaring in his ears. We ride. Now. They rode hard, harder than the horses should rightly have been asked to give. And somewhere in the pounding blur of it, Garrett's mind stopped being useful for anything except the worst possible arithmetic. 2 nights back. 2 nights. And he'd spent one of them sleeping easy in a shallow draw, thinking about a woman's steady voice instead of the 4 people he'd promised to protect. 'Cause that was the shape guilt always took with him. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet, relentless accounting tallying up every hour he'd spent feeling safe while somebody else was paying for it. Which was exactly the kind of thinking that got a man killed in a hurry, and he knew it, and he could not for the life of him make himself stop doing it anyway. Agatha, Ida, Adeline, Sable. 4 names over and over, keeping rhythm with the hoofbeats, until the names themselves stopped meaning anything except the raw, wordless dread underneath them. Except one name kept surfacing above the others, uninvited, insistent, and he hated himself a little for how much it scared him to realize which one it was. Senna wasn't there. Senna's safe. Senna's riding right beside you. So why did some animal, cornered part of him keep flinching at every mile marker, as if the danger might somehow still reach backward and take her too? He didn't have an answer. Didn't have time to look for one. There was only the road, and the horse straining under him, and the merciless patience of a desert that didn't care how fast a man rode, so long as the outcome waiting for him at the end of it had already, quietly, been decided 2 nights before he ever got the news. They didn't stop again until the ranch came into view, and by then the sun had gone down entirely, and there was no smoke rising from the chimney at all. The door hung broken on its hinge, same as the very first day Garrett had ever pushed through it, except this time there was no fire behind it. No warmth. No 4 women turning to measure him with careful, guarded eyes. Overturned chairs. Broken crockery scattered dark across the scrubbed floorboards. Agatha had once been so proud of. The quilts torn down from the north wall, trampled into the dirt somebody's boots had tracked in without a second thought for whose hands had hung them there in the first place. Senna moved through the wreckage a half step behind him, silent, and Garrett could feel the coiled stillness radiating off her, the stillness of a woman holding an enormous fear very carefully in both hands, so carefully that it hadn't yet found a way to spill out into her voice. Adeline, she was thinking, though she'd have bitten her own tongue before admitting it out loud. Not just a friend from the fort, not just somebody I promised to look after. If they've hurt her, she stopped the thought before it could finish, made herself stop it, because finishing it wouldn't help anybody standing in this wrecked room tonight, and because a woman who let her fear run that far ahead of her wasn't any good to the people who needed her steady. Later, she told herself. Fall apart later, if there's any falling apart left to do once this is finished. Not now. Just Ida, curled small in the corner of the main room, Sable asleep at last against her chest, her whole body shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Ida. Garrett dropped to his knees in front of her. Ida, look at me. Where are they? It took her a long time to get the words out. Longer than Garrett had patience for, and he hated himself for the flash of impatience, even as it rose in him. The girl in front of him had spent 2 days alone in a broken house, with an infant and the ringing echo of the worst night of her life. And she deserved every ounce of gentleness he could scrape together and wasn't finding easily. They took them, she finally managed. Agatha. Adeline. Agatha wouldn't stop fighting, and one of them hit her, and she went down. And I don't know if she's alive, Senna said. Firm, immediate, though nothing in her voice suggested she actually knew that for certain. It was the kind of lie a person tells because the alternative is unthinkable, and because sometimes, in the exact moment somebody needs it most, a lie is the only thing sturdy enough to hold a person upright. Otis, Ida said. It was Otis. He told them everything. When you'd be gone. Who to watch? He was never one of us at all. There's still one of them here, Ida added, her voice dropping unsteady. The one Agatha hit. He never woke up enough to ride out with the rest. I tied him myself, once I dared come up from the cellar. Didn't know what else to do with him. Garrett found the man in the lean-to behind the house, wrists bound tight with what looked like a torn strip of quilt, groggy, blinking up at the lantern light with the sullen fear of a man who has just understood, with total clarity, that his side of the night's business has gone very badly wrong. Where Garrett said, no preamble, no patience left to spend on any. The man said nothing. Senna crouched beside him, and there was something in the flat, quiet way she studied his face that made him flinch before she'd even opened her mouth. You can answer him, she said, or you can explain to Cormac Voss why you're the one who got left behind, tied in the house of the very women he sent you to take. I doubt he rewards men who become loose ends. The man's jaw worked, fear winning, slow visible over whatever loyalty he'd been paid to carry. Fort Reliance, he said finally, low. Old cavalry post west of here, past the dry wash. Been empty 5 years. Mr. Voss keeps men posted there sometimes, when he's got something he don't want found. His eyes darted between them, that's all I know. I swear it. I was just supposed to help bring them in. Nobody told me the rest. Who gave the orders, Garrett said. Kettering, Voss's man. He don't ask, he don't explain, just tells you where and when. The bound man swallowed hard. Please. I didn't touch either of them, Ruff. I swear it before God. Garrett looked at him a long moment, at the fear in his face, at the blood still crusted dark, where Agatha's skillet had opened his scalp, and felt no particular mercy stir in him at all, though he supposed, distantly, that a better man might have found some. Leave him for the sheriff, he said. Whatever that's worth these days. He walked to the barn. Pratt's gear was gone, bedroll, saddle, the whetstone he'd been sharpening that knife, with the night before Garrett rode out. Gone clean, in a hurry, except for one thing. Tucked half under a loose board where a man in too much of a rush to be careful had shoved it without thinking anybody would ever bother looking. A folded map, hand-drawn. Cutback Creek traced in careful ink from the eastern fence line down to a rock shelf Garrett recognized immediately, and beside it, in another hand entirely, a single word underlined twice. Silver. Garrett stood in the dark barn a long time, holding a piece of paper that changed the entire shape of everything he thought he understood, and felt something in his chest go hard and cold and absolutely, finally, done with being patient. This had never been about a dead lieutenant. Not really. Not only. It was about what ran underneath the water on his own land, and how far a man like Cormac Voss was willing to go to make sure nobody ever thought to look for it. Garrett. Senna's voice. From the barn door, low. We need to move. Now tonight, while the trail's still fresh enough to follow. He folded the map, put it inside his coat, next to a deed that had never once, from the very first day, meant what he'd thought it meant. Where would they take them? Someplace remote. Someplace nobody'd think to look or care to. Senna's jaw was tight, her eyes hard, and for the first time since he'd known her, Garrett saw something in her that looked less like caution and more like fury, banked low, entirely under control, and all the more dangerous for it. I know a place. Old Fort. Decommissioned 5 years back. If I were a man like Voss, wanting somewhere quiet to keep 2 women nobody's supposed to be looking for. Fort Reliance! Fort Reliance! Garrett looked at Ida, at Sable finally, mercifully, asleep against her shoulder, at the broken door, at the whole wreckage of a house that had, 3 weeks ago, been the first thing in years that had felt like it might be worth staying for. Lock what's left of that door, he said. Keep the rifle close. We'll send word from town, first chance we get. Bring them back, Ida whispered. Please, we will. He said it with more certainty than he had any honest right to feel. But some promises, he was learning, a man makes anyway, not because he knows for certain he can keep them, but because the alternative is letting the people counting on him see exactly how frightened he actually is. They stopped in town only long enough to change horses and send word, as promised, and it was pure chance or maybe not chance at all. Maybe just the particular gravity a guilty man's office seemed to exert on anyone passing near it after midnight that put them on the same stretch of boardwalk as Sheriff Deacon Rourke, standing alone outside his darkened office, a bottle in one hand that he made no effort to hide. Holt. His voice was rough. Not drink-rue. Something heavier than that. Heard about your place. Did you? Garrett didn't slow down. Funny how fast word travels, when it's the right kind of bad news. Rourke flinched faint, and Garrett almost kept walking, almost let the man's discomfort be somebody else's problem to sit with, almost. You knew, Garrett said instead, stopping, didn't you? Not the details, but you knew something was coming. Rourke didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone very quiet, very tired, the voice of a man who has spent a long while telling himself a comfortable story and has finally tonight run out of road to tell it on. I knew Voss doesn't send men out just to talk, he said. I didn't know when. I didn't know it'd be that house, that fast. He looked down at the bottle in his hand like he was surprised to find it there. That's supposed to make it better? No. Didn't think so. Senna stepped closer, her voice low-level, cutting through whatever self-pity Rourke seemed intent on drowning himself in. You could help us. I could. Rourke laughed, short, humorless, an echo of the sound Voss himself had made in the yard 3 days before, though Garrett doubted either man would have appreciated the comparison. And then my brother's debt comes due inside a month, and Voss's bank forecloses on the only thing my family's got left, and I'm no better use to anybody after that than I already am tonight. So that's your answer. Do nothing. Keep your badge and your brother's roof, and let 2 women rot in whatever hole Voss has put them in. That's not. Rourke stopped himself, started again, quieter. I can't ride with you tonight, Holt. I can't be seen doing it. But I can tell you the fort's held light most nights. 4 men, sometimes 6, and they rotate careless because nobody's ever once had reason to test them. He met Garrett's eyes, and something in his face looked almost like the man he might have been, once before the ledger of his own compromises had gotten so long he'd stopped being able to see the bottom of it. That's not nothing. It's not everything, either. No, Rourke agreed. It isn't. He turned back toward his dark office, bottle still in hand, and paused once more at the door. For what it's worth, I hope you get them out. I hope you get all of it out, in the end. Every last piece of what that man's done. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last of it. I just don't have the stomach left to be the one who does it. Garrett watched him go inside and didn't call after him. There wasn't anything left to say that would have changed the shape of the man standing in that doorway. Not tonight. He'll turn, Senna said quietly, once the door had shut. Men like that always do, eventually. The only question's whether it happens before the cost gets too high or after. Let's hope it's before. They rode out within the hour, into a dark that had teeth in it now. Garrett let the miles pass in silence, and inside that silence his own mind would not sit still, because he kept seeing Agatha's steady hands on that bread pan, that very first morning, and Adeline's ring, turned slow between her fingers by the fire, which meant he kept seeing, too, all the ways this could already be too late, no matter how hard the horse under him strained against the dark. Except thinking that way helped nobody. He knew it. Knew it the same way he'd known, 3 years back, that panic in the field only ever cost more lives than it saved. So he made himself stop, made himself count breaths instead of fears. 1, 2, 3, until the counting itself became its own kind of prayer. Wordless, useless. The only thing he had left to offer 2 women he hadn't managed to protect the first time trouble came calling. Not again, he thought. Not this time. And then quieter, underneath that, a thought he didn't let himself finish out loud. because finishing it felt too much like admitting how much had already changed in him these past 3 weeks, that somewhere between a broken lock and a baby's cry and a woman who called him by his given name for the first time under a wide, indifferent sky, this ranch, and the people scattered wounded and stolen across it tonight, had stopped being merely his responsibility. They'd become, without his ever quite noticing the exact moment it happened, the thing he was actually fighting for, toward a fort that had stood empty 5 years, and was about to, one way or another, stop being empty at all. Inside the old guardhouse at Fort Reliance, in a room that smelled of dust and gun oil, and years of Agatha came back to herself slowly, the pain in her soul arriving before her memory did, a dull, insistent throb that made the dim lamplight feel like noon sun. Easy, Adeline's voice close, low. Don't sit up. Too fast. Agatha blinked the room into focus. Adobe walls. A single barred window. High, useless. Adeline crouched beside her, wrists bound in front of her rather than behind some small, careless mercy, or more likely simple laziness on the part of whoever had tied them. How long Agatha managed, since last night. They've fed us once. Water twice. Adeline's jaw was tight, the calm of a woman, rationing her own fear so carefully that none of it showed on the surface. Nobody's told us anything. Nobody's asked us anything either, which frightens me more than if they had. Why? Because a man who wants information moves quickly. A man who's simply waiting for something else to happen first has all the time in the world to be patient with us. Adeline looked toward the door. I think we're being kept. Not questioned. Kept. Agatha absorbed that, turning it over with the same careful attention she'd once given a difficult student's excuse, testing it for the shape of the truth underneath. Kept until what? I don't know. But I don't intend to sit here and simply wait to find out. Adeline held up her bound wrists, showing Agatha the knot clumsy, hurried, tied by a man in more of a rush, to be done with the job than to be good at it. I've been working at this since I woke. It's loosening. Something that might, on a better day, have been a smile flickered at the corner of Agatha's mouth. 30 years teaching children to sit still in a chair, and here I am, proudest of the one who never learned to stay tied down. You taught her that. I taught all of you that, whether any of us meant for the lesson to take this particular shape. Agatha shifted, testing her own bindings with as little movement as she could manage, wincing against the throb still radiating from her temple. Garrett will come. Will he? He will. Agatha said it with the flat, unshakable certainty of a woman who had decided somewhere in the last several hours that belief itself was one more thing she refused to let anyone take from her. And when he does, I intend for us to already have most of the work done ourselves. I've never much cared for being rescued passively. Strikes me as poor manners, letting somebody else do all the difficult part. Adeline laughed softly, surprising herself with the sound of it, a small, real thing, entirely out of place in a locked room in an abandoned fort, and all the more precious for how impossible it felt to have found it there at all. Keep working the rope, Agatha said. I'll keep watching the door. Between the two of us, we'll have found some kind of chance by the time anyone thinks to come check on us. As if summoned by the thought itself, boots sounded outside the door a moment later, heavy, unhurried, a key working in the lock. Adeline froze, wrists still half-bound, and Agatha's hand found hers in the dim light, quick, steady, a silent instruction to still herself and wait. The door opened. A broad-shouldered man Adeline didn't recognize stood in the frame, lamp in one hand, eyes moving over the two of them, with the flat, assessing look of a man checking on livestock rather than people. Still breathing. Both of you, he said. Not quite a question. Mr. Voss, don't take kindly to spoiled goods. Tell your Mr. Voss, Agatha said, her voice steady despite the blood, still dried dark along her hairline, that I've taught rooms full of children with less manners than you, and every one of them grew up to know better than to speak about women as though they were freight. Something flickered in the man's face, not quite amusement, not quite offense, some uncomfortable middle ground. He clearly hadn't expected to be standing in this early in the morning. You'll want to watch that tongue, he said. But there was less conviction in it than the words themselves suggested, and he pulled the door shut again without further comment, the lock turning heavy behind him. Adeline let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. You shouldn't provoke them. Perhaps not. Agatha's mouth twitched, something almost like satisfaction ghosting across her bruised face. But a man who's busy being embarrassed is a man who isn't paying close attention to what your hands are doing under that rope. Keep working, dear. We haven't got all morning. Outside, the first gray hint of dawn was just beginning to touch the top of the old parade ground wall, and neither woman yet knew how close. In the very same breath of pale early light, help had already come. Fort Reliance rose out of the desert just before dawn, low and pale against the graying sky. Adobe walls crumbling in places where 5 winters of neglect had chewed through what soldiers once kept whitewashed and proud. It looked, Garrett thought, less like a fort and more like a headstone somebody had built too large and simply walked away from. They left the horses tied a half-mile back, in a stand of scrub too thin to hide much of anything but better than nothing, and went the rest of the way on foot, slow, the way Senna moved, when the ground itself seemed to matter more to her than the sky above it. There, she breathed, dropping flat behind a fallen section of wall, pulling Garrett down beside her, a single sentry pacing the old parade ground, rifle slung loose over one shoulder, entirely too relaxed for a man guarding anything worth the name. Behind him, faint light showed at one window of what had once, Garrett guessed, been the guardhouse. That's where they'll be, Senna murmured, if they're anywhere. How many more? Rourke said 4 to 6. I count one moving. Doesn't mean the rest are asleep. They lay still a long while, watching, counting seconds instead of men, because seconds were the one thing either of them could actually be certain of. The sentry made his slow circuit of the parade ground, boots scuffing loud in the pre-dawn hush, and disappeared for a stretch behind the old stables before reappearing again on the far side, unhurried, bored, a man performing a duty he'd long since stopped believing mattered. He'll pass again in 5 minutes, Senna said. Same pace both times. Men who patrol board patrol predictable. You've done this before. More times than I'd care to count, and never once for a reason that felt as plain as this one does. She glanced at him, something flickering behind her eyes that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite anything else either, just the weight of a person about to do something irreversible, and choosing to do it anyway. You ready? No. Good. Ready men get careless. She checked the knife at her belt, the rifle slung across her back, every motion economical, practiced, betraying nothing of whatever storm might have been moving underneath it. We wait for him to turn his back at the stables. Then we cross, fast, low, no hesitating. Halfway they waited. The sentry made his circuit, passed behind the stables exactly as predicted, and the instant his shape vanished from view, Senna was moving and Garrett was moving with her, low and fast across open ground that felt, in that stretched, silent handful of seconds, like the widest and most exposed piece of earth either of them had ever crossed in their lives. Garrett's boot caught a loose stone halfway across. It skittered, sharp and impossibly loud in the pre-dawn tense stillness, and both of them froze, flat against the crumbling adobe, breath held, waiting for a shout, a rifle cocking, anything at all that would mean the whole plan had come apart before it had even properly begun. Nothing came. Somewhere beyond the stables, the sentry's boots kept their same slow, bored rhythm, undisturbed, and after a long, aching moment, Senna let out a breath through her teeth and gave Garrett a look that managed to convey, without a single word, exactly how much trouble he'd have been in if that stone had cost them the whole night. They reached the gap in the wall without further incident and slipped through, into the fort's crumbling interior, into whatever waited for them now on the other side of it. We go in quiet, he said, as quiet as we can manage. Fight only if we have to. And if we have to. He looked at her, at the hard, steady set of her jaw in the thin gray light, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with fear at all, though by every reasonable measure fear was exactly what the moment called for. Then we fight, he said, and we don't stop until Agatha and Adeline are walking out of that gap in the wall beside us. Senna checked the rifle one last time. Nodded once, the nod of a woman who has already decided, somewhere deep and quiet inside herself, exactly how far she's willing to go tonight, and has made an uneasy peace with the cost of it. Then let's go get them. They moved together deeper into the compound, low, silent, the last of the night's dark closing protectively around them for just a little while longer, and somewhere ahead of them, in a guardhouse lit by a single lamp, 2 women who had already survived more than most people survive in a lifetime were about to find out whether help had actually come, or whether the dark outside their window was just one more cruelty the night had decided to play on them before it finished with them for good. 40 miles east, In the same gray hour, Cormac Voss read the message Kettering had ridden half the night to deliver, and set it down on his desk with the unhurried calm of a man who has learned over many years that satisfaction is best savored slowly. Both of them, quite a question. Both, sir. The teacher put up a fight. The other one, less so. Once the teacher went down, and the ranch, one man lost, left behind tied, otherwise clean. Kettering hesitated. The scout and Holt were away. Larkspur, by the timing of it. Circuit Court. Something in Voss's expression sharpened, briefly, then smoothed back over into its habitual pleasant stillness. They'll have gone looking for the judge's help. It won't matter. A judge needs paper, and paper is precisely the thing I've made certain does not exist anymore, wherever it once might have. You're certain of that, sir? The ledger. I'm certain enough. Voss's fingers drummed once against the desk, the only outward crack in an otherwise perfectly composed surface. I had every officer's private effects at Fort Kestrel searched the week after Voss's accident. Thoroughly. If a ledger existed, Mr. Kettering, I'd have found it by now, and you would not be standing here asking me foolish questions about its whereabouts. Kettering had the good sense to look appropriately chastened. Of course, sir, and the survey. How much longer? Assayer says another 2 weeks confirms the full run of the vein. Maybe less, if the weather holds. Voss nodded satisfied, and something in the ease of that nod told Kettering everything he needed to know about which of tonight's 2 pieces of news actually mattered most to the man sitting behind that desk. 2 women taken. A vein of silver confirmed. Only one of those facts, Kettering understood, would keep Cormac Voss awake tonight with anything resembling satisfaction. And it wasn't the one involving human beings. And the 2 women, sir. What would you have done with them? Voss considered the question with the same unhurried care he gave to a contract or a ledger, turning it over, weighing its angles. Keep them separate, he said finally. Comfortable enough that neither starves or dies before I've decided what use they still are to me. The teacher's stubborn, she'll keep her silence out of pride alone. The widow's the one who matters. She still believes, somewhere under all that grief, that the law is going to save her. He almost smiled. Grief makes people generous with information. Mr. Kettering, if you're patient enough to let it work on them properly. And if Holt comes looking, then he'll find exactly what I want him to find, precisely when I want him to find it. Voss rose, walked to the window, looked out over land that had, for one brief, irritating season, threatened to slip past his troll entirely, and no longer would. A man in love with a cause makes foolish decisions in a hurry, Mr. Kettering. I intend to let Mr. Holt make several more of them before this is finished. He returned to his desk, picked up his pen, and went back to his ledgers, with the calm, untroubled patience of a man who had never once, in his entire life, believed that consequences were something that happened to people like him. The guardhouse door wasn't locked from the outside. That was the first thing Garrett noticed, crouched low against the adobe wall, and it should have comforted him. It didn't. A door left unlocked from the outside usually meant one of 2 things: carelessness, or a man so confident in what waited on the other side that a lock felt unnecessary. He didn't know yet which one he was about to find. Senna's hand found his shoulder. 2 fingers, pressed once, then gone. Wait, he'd learned her silent vocabulary over the 3 weeks, the way a man learns anything that matters slowly, then all at once, until it stopped feeling like a foreign language, and started feeling like the only one worth speaking. She eased the door open an inch. 2. Enough to see lamplight, low and yellow, and 2 shapes on the floor against the far wall. Agatha, Garrett breathed. Barely sound at all. The older woman's head came up sharp, eyes finding them in the doorway, and something in her face did a thing Garrett would remember a long while afterward, not relief exactly. Something harder one than relief. The look of a woman who had refused, for 2 straight days, to let herself believe help was coming, and now had to reckon with the cost of having been wrong about that. "You're late," Agatha whispered, and even bruised and bound, she still managed to make it sound like a complaint about tardiness to class. "Traffic," Garrett whispered back. "Already moving, already working at the rope on her wrists, which came apart easier than it should have. We'd already loosened them," Adeline said, low, urgent, rising unsteady to her feet. Agatha's stubborn. "Wouldn't stop working at the knot, even with the concussion. Add it to the list of things I don't intend to apologize for." Senna was at the window, watching the yard, her whole body gone taut and still. "We have maybe 4 minutes before that sentry comes back around. Then we don't waste them." Garrett got Adeline's bonds free, helped her stand, felt how badly her legs shook underneath her, and hated, with a sudden total clarity, every single man who'd put that shake there. "Can you run?" "I can run," Adeline said, though her voice wavered on the word, and Garrett understood it wasn't a lie. Exactly. Just a promise she intended to keep no matter what it cost her. They moved toward the door in a tight, careful line. Senna first, then Agatha, then Adeline. Garrett bringing up the rear with his rifle low and ready. They almost made it. The shout came from behind the stable, sharp, sudden, a man's voice cracking the pre-dawn quiet wide open. "Guardhouse! Somebody's in the guardhouse!" Everything after that happened too fast for careful thought, which was, Garrett would reflect much later, exactly the way these things always seem to happen. Plans held right up until the moment they didn't. And then a person simply had to trust whatever training and instinct they'd built up in the years before that moment arrived. Because there wasn't time for anything else. Because thinking, actual careful thinking, was a luxury built for calmer rooms than this one, which meant the only thing was motion, reaction. The old buried cavalry reflexes Garrett had spent 3 years trying to bury even deeper, rising back up now exactly when he needed them most, whether he'd wanted them back or not. "Go," Senna snapped, already turning, already raising the rifle toward the shape, sprinting toward them across the parade ground. "Get them to the wall, I'll hold here." Senna, "Go, Garrett, now." He went, because there wasn't time to argue, because Adeline was stumbling, and Agatha's face had gone the gray color of a woman running on nothing but will alone, and because some decisions a man makes, not because he's certain they're right, but because every second spent debating them costs more than the decision itself. Behind him, Senna's rifle cracked once, twice. Shout cut short. More shouting now. From multiple directions, the whole compound waking up around them like a hive somebody had just put a boot through. Dust. Noise. The chaos of a fight that hasn't yet organized itself into anything a person could properly follow. Garrett's whole world narrowed down to the next 10 feet of ground, and then the next 10 after that, until distance itself stopped meaning anything except the gap in the wall. Still too far away, always too far away. They reached it eventually. Garrett pushed Adeline through first, then Agatha, and turned back to find Senna already sprinting toward them. Low, fast, another shot cracking off the adobe behind her close enough that Garrett felt the sting of stones against his own cheek. "Move," she gasped, diving through the gap a half-second before a bullet took a chunk out of the wall exactly where her head had been. They ran. All 4 of them, stumbling, gasping. Still a half-mile off across open scrubland that had never in Garrett's life felt so wide or so entirely without cover. Behind them, hoofbeats. Fast, closing. It'd make the horses. Garrett understood that with a kind of cold, falling clarity about 30 yards short of the scrub where they'd tied the animals, when 3 riders cut across the open ground ahead of them and reined up hard, rifles already leveled, and there was nowhere left to run that wouldn't put a bullet in somebody's back before they managed 3 more steps. "Down," Senna said, and they went down, all of them, flat against the cold ground, rifles up, the 4 of them, forming a rough half-circle against an enemy that had them outnumbered and outpositioned in every way that mattered. And then, from the direction of the fort, more riders, a larger group this time, unhurried, the pace of men who already believed the outcome of the next several minutes had been decided before it started. Cormac Voss rode at the front of them. Beside him, and Garrett's stomach dropped clean through the floor of him at the sight, Sheriff Deacon Rourke. "Well," Voss said, reining up at a comfortable distance, surveying the tableau in front of him with the satisfaction of a man watching a plan come together exactly as intended. "I did wonder how long it would take you to make this mistake, Mr. Holt." "Wasn't a mistake," Garrett said. "Came out about the way I expected." "Did it?" Voss's gaze slid over Agatha, over Adeline, lingered a moment on Senna, with something colder in it than simple appraisal. "You've cost me a great deal trouble tonight. I'd think carefully about what happens next, if I were standing where you're standing." "You mean the part where you explain to a federal judge why you had 2 women kidnapped and held at an abandoned military post," Adeline said, her voice shaking with exhaustion, but not with fear, not anymore, not after everything the last 2 days had already cost her to survive. "That trouble, or a different one?" Something flickered across Voss's face, brief, cold, gone almost before it arrived. "There won't be a federal judge involved in this, Mrs. Voss. He said her name like it tasted faintly unpleasant in his mouth. "There's a fort full of men here who'll swear you and your companions rode in armed, intent on theft. There's a sheriff standing right beside me to make the arrest official." He glanced briefly at Rourke. "Isn't that right, Sheriff?" Every eye in the standoff turned toward Rourke. He sat his horse a long, silent moment, and Garrett watched something move behind the man's eyes, the same weight he'd seen outside the darkened office 3 nights before, except heavier now, closer to whatever breaking point a man reaches right before he finally, irrevocably, chooses a side. "Sheriff," Voss said again, sharper this time, "I asked you a question." "You did," Rourke said, quiet. And then in a single suction that seemed to take the entire yard, several full seconds to properly understand, he drew his revolver and leveled it. Not at Garrett, not at Senna, but square at Cormac Voss's chest. "Deacon." Voss's voice had lost every trace of its earlier ease. "Think very carefully about what you're doing." "I have thought about it," Rourke said. "Longer than you'd probably like to know. Every night since I stood over Lieutenant Voss's body and told myself a girth just snaps sometimes, when I knew full well it doesn't. Every night since I let his widow get thrown off that post with nothing but a week's notice and no pension, because it was easier than asking the question that mattered." His hand didn't waver. "I thought about my brother's debt, too. Thought real hard about what it had cost him if I ever crossed you. And I decided, somewhere around the third night I couldn't sleep for thinking about it, that there's costs a man can live with, and costs that just slowly kill the part of him worth living with in the first place. You'll hang for this. Maybe." Rourke's jaw was tight, his voice steady despite it. "But I'll hang having finally done one honest thing in 3 years, and that's better than the alternative I've been living with instead." Voss's men shifted, uncertain, rifles wavering between targets that no longer made simple sense to aim at. Garrett used the confusion, moved fast, got Agatha and Adeline behind the scant cover of a fallen wall section, while Senna covered the angle Rourke's defection had opened. "This changes nothing," Voss said, though something in his voice had gone thin now, stretched, the sound of a man watching a carefully built structure begin, for the first time, to genuinely shake. "I still own half the paper in this county. I still hold contracts on 3 forts. A sheriff's betrayal doesn't undo any of that." "No," Garrett called back, rising just enough to be seen, rifle steady. "But it's a start." "You have nothing," Voss snapped. "No ledger, no witness withstanding. Just a scout's word and a widow's grief, same as you had riding into Larkspur, and that wasn't enough then either." "I have Rourke," Garrett said. "I have the man your people left tied at my ranch, ready to swear whose orders he was following. And I have this." He drew the folded map from inside his coat, held it up where the growing dawn light could catch it. "Cutback Creek. Silver underlined twice in your own man's hand. That's not grief, Voss, that's motive." For the first time since Garrett had laid eyes on him, Cormac Voss looked briefly, genuinely uncertain. "That map means nothing without an assayer's report to match it." "Then it's a good thing," Adeline said, rising unsteady but resolute from behind the wall, "that Marcus mentioned the assayer's name to me himself more than once, in the weeks before he died. A man named Whitlock, out of Tucson, who Marcus said had been paid a great deal of money to swear a survey clean that wasn't. I remembered it 3 nights ago in that guardhouse, when I had nothing else left to do, but remember everything my husband ever told me, and pray some of it would matter." Her eyes burned, dry, fierce, entirely unbroken, despite everything the last 2 days had tried to do to her. "You should have made certain that name died with him, Mr. Voss. Instead you let his widow live long enough to remember it." Something in Voss's face went very still, very cold. The look of a man watching every careful piece of a plan he'd spent 2 years building come apart, one small, unstoppable fact at a time. "Kettering," he said low, not turning his head. "Kill the widow." For one suspended, terrible second, nobody moved. Then everything moved at once. Kettering's rifle swung toward Adeline. Senna fired first, a single shot that took him high in the shoulder and spun him half around, before he ever managed to pull the trigger, and the whole yard erupted. Gunfire cracking from every direction at once. Voss's remaining men scattering for whatever cover the open ground could offer, which wasn't much and wasn't enough. Garrett grabbed Agatha, hauled her behind the fallen wall section, felt a bullet snap past close enough to hear the air split around it. Beside him, Rourke had swung down off his horse, using the animal's bulk as cover, still firing. His own men, Voss's men. Garrett corrected himself. because whatever loyalty Rourke's badge had once commanded from them had clearly evaporated the instant his gun found a new target, no longer entirely certain which direction their obedience was supposed to point. "Voss," Garrett shouted over the chaos. "Call them off. It's finished. You know it's finished." Voss had gone still on his horse, exposed, alone now in a way he hadn't been 10 minutes earlier. Most of his men either down or fled or standing frozen, watching their employer's own sheriff-turned-traitor in front of them. Finished. Voss said the word like it tasted strange in his mouth. Foreign. A concept that had simply never applied to him before in his entire life, and didn't know quite how to sit now that it finally had. "You understand nothing, Mr. Holt. Nothing at all." "Then explain it to me," Garrett said, echoing without quite meaning to the very words he'd first said to this man in his own front yard 3 weeks before. And Voss, cornered, exposed, watching the last of his careful architecture crumble around him in the cold gray light of a dawn he clearly hadn't planned on losing, began finally to laugh. "You want to understand it," he said. "Fine. I'll give you that much, since it seems I've little enough left to lose by it now." He looked at Garrett with something that might, on another man's face, have passed for genuine amusement. "Do you know why I sold you that ranch, Mr. Holt? Why you, specifically, out of every buyer who might have made an offer? Enlighten me." "I made inquiries before the sale. It's what a careful man does when he's got something valuable sitting on a piece of land he needs off his books quietly." Voss's horse shifted under him, and he steadied it without looking, the motion entirely automatic. A man too many years in the saddle to ever need to think about it. "I learned you were cavalry. Discharged under circumstances you didn't discuss. A man carrying guilt heavy enough that he'd bought remote land specifically to be alone with it." He shook his head slowly, almost admiring. "Do you understand what that meant to me? A guilty man doesn't ask questions, Mr. Holt. A guilty man wants distance and silence, and nobody looking too closely at anything, including the deed he's just signed. You were, by every measure that mattered to me, the perfect fool." The words landed in Garrett's chest like a physical blow, and for a moment the whole yard, the gunfire, the wounded men, all of it fell away into a strange, ringing silence that existed only between the two of them. "You picked me," Garrett said, slow, working through it even as he said it out loud, "because you thought a broken man wouldn't look hard enough to notice what he'd bought." "I picked you," Voss said, "because I was right. You didn't notice. Not for 6 weeks. Not until 4 women and an infant forced the matter into your front room whether you wanted it there or not." Something almost like respect flickered across his face. "You should be thanking them, Mr. Holt, not standing here pointing rifles at me on their behalf. If they hadn't shown up uninvited, you'd still be exactly the incurious tenant I paid good money to install on top of the richest vein this territory's seen in a decade." Garrett stood there a long moment, letting it settle, letting the full, ugly shape of it finally sit still in him instead of sliding past unexamined the way so much else had these past 3 years. He'd been used, not accidentally, not incidentally, deliberately selected, the way a man selects a tool for a specific job, chosen precisely because his own grief had made him exactly the kind of blind, convenient instrument a man like Voss needed, standing quietly on top of a fortune, asking no inconvenient questions about how he'd come to be there. Because that's what guilt does, if you let it run the whole show, he thought, the realization arriving in pieces, sharp and unwelcome. It doesn't just weigh a man down. It makes him useful to exactly the wrong kind of people. Makes him small enough to walk right past without ever once looking up, which meant the version of himself that had ridden onto this land 3 weeks ago, silent, solitary, determined to see nothing and question nothing, and simply serve his own private penance. In peace had been, without ever once realizing it, doing precisely what a man like Cormac Voss needed him to do. Except he hadn't stayed that man. And Garrett understood, standing in that yard with a rifle in his hands and 4 survivors at his back, that the version of himself capable of understanding that difference, capable of choosing, finally, to look up, to ask questions, to let 4 strangers' danger become his own business, whether it was convenient or not, was the only answer he had left to give the tried so carefully to make sure he never would. "You lost," Garrett said, "the day I stopped being the fool you were counting on." Voss's smile didn't waver. "Did I?" His hand moved, fast for a man his age, reaching for the pistol at his hip in the same unhurried, practiced motion he'd used on that first visit to Copperline's porch 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. Rourke fired first. The shot took Voss square in the chest, and he sat there a moment, swaying, an expression of genuine, almost childlike surprise crossing his face, the surprise of a man who has spent his entire life believing consequences were a thing that happened to other, lesser people, confronting, in his very last conscious second, the plain evidence that he had been wrong about that the whole time. He fell from the saddle without another word. The yard went silent, except for the wind and the low, ragged breathing of people who had just survived something none of them had fully believed. Until that exact moment, they actually would. Rourke lowered the revolver, slow, his hand shaking now that there was finally nothing left in front of him worth aiming at, and looked at Garrett with the hollowed expression of a man who has just done the one right thing and does not yet know what to do with the enormous, unfamiliar weight of it. "I'll need to answer for that," he said. "Killing him. However it happened, however it needed to happen, there's going to be a hearing." "There will," Garrett agreed. "And you'll have 5 witnesses standing right here, ready to swear he drew first, and a widow, a teacher, and a scout, ready to swear to everything that led up to it." "That's not nothing," Adeline said, echoing. Without meaning to, the very words Rourke himself had offered them 3 nights before, on a dark boardwalk outside a darkened office. It might even be enough. Rourke looked down at Voss's body a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, not quite grief. Nothing so generous as that, but something adjacent to it. 2 years, he said, quiet, mostly to himself. 2 years I told myself I was just keeping my head down, protecting my brother, waiting for a better moment that never once arrived on its own. He shook his head slowly. Should have drawn on him the very first week he asked me to look the other way. Would have saved a great deal of grief for a great many people, myself included. "You did it eventually," Senna said. "That's not nothing, either." Eventually, Rourke's mouth twisted bitter. "Ask Lieutenant Foss's widow how much comfort there is in eventually." "I'm not comforted," Adeline said, honest, steady. "But I'm alive. And so is Agatha. Eventually got us that much, Sheriff, even if it took longer than any of us would have wished for." She met his eyes, and something in her face, exhausted as it was, held real, and considered forgiveness in it not easy forgiveness, but the harder one kind that comes from a person who has decided, deliberately, that carrying hatred forward serves nobody, least of all herself. "Testify. Fully. Every piece of it. That's the only apology that's ever going to mean anything. Coming from you, I intend to," Rourke said. "Every word." They tended the wounded as best they could, Kettering, bleeding but stable. The last of Voss's scattered men either fled entirely or too demoralized to offer further resistance and rode out from Fort Reliance, as the sun finally cleared the horizon fully, throwing long gold light across a compound that had, in the space of one impossibly long night, stopped belonging to Cormac Voss in every sense that mattered. Ida saw them coming from a half-mile off, and was already running down the drive, sable bouncing, awkward and startled against her hip, by the time the little procession came fully into view. "Agatha." Her voice cracked on both names. We're really," Agatha said, and for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun, something in her carefully maintained composure finally, fully broke, and she pulled Ida into an embrace that had nothing careful left in it at all, both of them crying openly, unashamed, in the middle of a dusty drive under a wide Arizona sky that had for once decided to be kind. Adeline knelt slowly, wincing, and Sable reached for her immediately, small fingers finding a fistful of her dress and holding on with the same fierce, unreasoning grip she'd once used on Garrett's shirt that very first quiet evening by the fire. "Hello, little one," Adeline whispered, and something in her voice, roughened by exhaustion and grief and 2 days of captivity, had gone soft in a way Garrett hadn't heard from her before. "Somebody kept the fire going for us, I hear." "She never stopped believing you'd come back," Ida said, wiping at her own face. "Neither of you. Not once. I don't know how she knew. I just know she wouldn't let me think otherwise. Not for one single hour." Garrett stood a little apart from the reunion, letting it belong entirely to the people who'd earned it, and felt Senna come to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You did that," she said, quiet, nodding toward the scene in front of them. "Whatever else happens next. You did that." "We did that," he corrected. "All of us. I didn't do a single piece of this alone, and I don't much care to pretend otherwise." Something in Senna's face softened, unguarded, in a way he'd rarely seen it. "No," she agreed. "I don't suppose you did." He told them all of it that evening, once Agatha and Adeline had eaten and rested enough to sit upright by the fire. Because he'd decided somewhere on the ride home that a truth this large didn't belong only to him, sitting quiet and unspoken in his own chest. "Voss picked me on purpose," he said when the moment finally came. "Not by chance. He looked for a man broken enough not to ask questions, and he found me, and he was right about it for 6 whole weeks." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Ida's hand had gone still on Sable's back. Pat. Agatha's eyes, bruised and tired, had sharpened considerably. "That's a hard thing to carry," Agatha said finally. "Learning your own grief got used as somebody else's weapon." "It is." Garrett stared into the fire. "I keep turning it over, trying to decide what it means about the man I was, that I fit so easily into the shape he needed." "It means," Adeline said, quiet but firm, "that grief makes all of us vulnerable to being used, at one time or another. It very nearly made me a woman who simply waited for a law that was never coming to save her. It made Ida believe for a while that she deserved to be thrown away." She looked at him steadily. "The measure of a man isn't whether grief ever made him useful to somebody cruel. It's whether he stayed that way, once he had the choice not to. I didn't stay that way." "No," Senna said, from beside him, her hand finding his. "You very much didn't. That's the whole of what matters now." Ida spoke up then, quiet, careful, working through something of her own. "If he hadn't picked you," she said, "hadn't needed exactly that kind of broken, quiet man, we'd never have found this place. Never have found each other." She looked around the room, at Agatha, at Adeline, at Sable asleep now against her shoulder. "I don't know how to feel grateful to a man like Voss for anything. But I think, in some strange backward way, his own cruelty is part of how all of us ended up standing in this room together." "That's not gratitude," Agatha said gently. "That's simply noticing that good things can grow out of terrible soil, given enough stubborn hands willing to tend them. It doesn't excuse the soil. It just means we refuse to let it be the only thing that grew there." Garrett sat with that a while, the fire crackling low, and found, by the time the household finally drifted off toward sleep, that the weight of Voss's confession had settled into something he could carry, rather than something that threatened to crush him entirely not forgotten. Never that, but folded properly into the larger, harder-won story of everything that had happened since. Later, once the house had gone quiet, and the fire had burned down to a low orange breath in the hearth, Garrett found Senna still awake on the porch, watching the same wide field of stars she'd watched with him once before, that very first night. He sat down beside her, closer than he had that first time. "I told you I might tell you the rest of it someday," he said, "when I trusted myself not to let it swallow us both." Senna didn't answer right away, just waited, giving him the room to arrive at his own pace instead of hers. "The child I told you about," he said. "The one who died in my arms after her mother went down." His voice had gone low, rough, each word costing him something to produce. "I've spent 3 years telling myself the story stopped there, that I held her until she stopped breathing, and that was the whole of it, and nothing I did afterward could ever balance that scale. And now? Now I think I've been using that story wrong." He looked out at the dark, at the shape of the barn, the corral, the whole quiet, hard-won life sitting around them in the dark. "I told myself the guilt was supposed to be a punishment, something I carried to prove I understood what I'd done. Except a man like Voss looked at that guilt and saw something else entirely. Saw a tool. Saw a man too busy punishing himself to notice what was happening right in front of him. So you've decided to stop punishing yourself." "I've decided," Garrett said, slow, working it out even as he said it, "that the only way to actually honor what happened at that creek is to make sure it changes what I do now, not just what I feel. What I do." He turned to look at her fully. "I couldn't save that child, I know that. I'll know it the rest of my life. But I could stand between 4 strangers and a man who wanted to erase them, and I did. And that has to count for something more than just another entry on the same old ledger of things I couldn't fix." Senna was quiet a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone soft in a way he'd rarely heard from her. "My mother used to say Anne's whole worth isn't decided by the worst thing he ever did," she said. "It's decided by what he chooses to build, standing in the wreckage of it afterward." She reached over, took his hand, held it simply, without ceremony. "I think you've started building something worth the effort, Garrett Holt. I intend to stay and watch the rest of it get built, if you'll have me." "I'll have you," he said, and meant it more completely than he'd meant almost anything in 3 long years. They sat together a long while after that, hands joined, saying nothing further, because some moments don't need any more words added to them to be understood completely. The days that followed belonged almost entirely to recovery, and Agatha, predictably, made a difficult patient of herself from the very first morning. "You are not," Ida said, standing over her with both hands on her hips in a fair imitation of Agatha's own schoolroom authority, getting out of that bed to check on the bread. "The bread doesn't know it's supposed to wait for my head to stop ringing. The bread will survive one morning without your supervision, Agatha. I've watched you make it 100 times. I believe I've absorbed the general principle." "General principle," Agatha repeated, with the withering emphasis of a woman who had spent 30 years correcting students who thought they understood something a great deal better than they actually did. "There is nothing general about proper bread, Ida Marsh. There is precision and there is disappointment, and I intend to be present to prevent the latter." Adeline, propped in the next bed with a cup of broth she was making a visible show of resenting, caught Garrett's eye from across the room, and very nearly smiled the first real, almost smile he'd seen crossed her face since the whole ordeal had begun. "They've been at this since dawn," she said low, amused despite everything. "I believe it's doing more to speed her recovery than the actual rest is." Being right at people generally does seem to agree with her. It's the only medicine she's ever fully trusted. Sable, oblivious to the entire debate, had installed herself firmly on the end of Agatha's bed and was narrating, with great seriousness, an ongoing dispute between two wooden spoons she'd appointed as the principal actors in some private drama only she understood. And Agatha, despite everything, despite the bruise still darkening along her temple, found the patience to listen to every word of it, as though it mattered enormously, because to Sable, in that moment, it clearly did. It was, Garrett thought, watching from the doorway, exactly the kind of ordinary, argumentative, thoroughly alive scene that made the whole cost of the last several days feel, finally, like it had bought something worth having. Word of what had happened at Fort Reliance spread through Draycott within days, and with it came something Garrett hadn't expected: neighbors. People who'd once whispered about squatters and unnatural arrangements, showing up instead with lumber and nails and hands willing to help rebuild a door that had been broken twice now in the space of a single hard month. The storekeeper came himself, hauling a wagon of donated supplies. He insisted, gruffly, weren't charity, just good business sense, since a ranch that couldn't rebuild its own front door wasn't likely to keep buying wire and seed from a man who wanted their custom for years to come. A woman who'd once warned Garrett darkly about the impropriety of his household came too, a basket of preserves in her hands, and an apology in her mouth that she clearly didn't know how to deliver gracefully. And Agatha, hearing her out from the porch, simply said, "Apologies given honestly are worth accepting honestly. Come in. There's coffee, and considerably less judgment in this house than there apparently is in your general store." By the time the new door hung solid on its hinges, a week later, Copperline had gained not just a repaired house, but the beginning of something that would eventually grow into the wider, mixed, imperfectly reconciled community it became, built, in no small part, in the slow, unglamorous work of people deciding, one uncomfortable apology and one shared afternoon of labor at a time, that the old lines between who belonged and who didn't were no longer worth the effort of maintaining. 6 weeks later, exactly as promised, Judge Corwin Ashby rode his next circuit through Draycott, and this time, the hearing he convened filled every available seat in the small courthouse annex, townsfolk crowding the doorway to hear testimony that had, by then, traveled the length of the territory several times over in whispered, half-accurate versions. Rourke testified first, plainly, without flinching, laying out 2 years of compromise and complicity in a flat, steady voice that seemed to Garrett's ear to be paying down a debt one honest word at a time. He named every shipment he'd been paid to overlook, every threat Voss had made against his brother, every night he'd told himself it was somebody else's business to fix. The wounded man from Copperline testified next, thinner now, chastened, corroborating Rourke's account down to dates and amounts, and Adeline followed him, calm and precise, laying out the whole architecture of her husband's death, with a composure that cost her visibly and that she refused entirely to let crack in front of the room. A lawyer retained by Voss's estate rose to cross-examine her, sharp-suited, unfamiliar with anything resembling the territory's harder truths, and made the mistake of assuming a grieving widow would be an easy witness to unsettle. "You have no direct evidence," he said, "that Mr. Voss himself ordered the sabotage of your husband's equipment. Only the word of a scout, offered secondhand. I have Sheriff Rourke's sworn testimony that Mr. Voss personally directed the cover-up," Adeline said, unhurried, and Mr. Kettering's own confession, given this very morning, that he received the order directly from Mr. Voss's mouth. "I'd hardly call that second-hand, Counselor. I'd call it considerably more corroborated than most convictions this court has likely ever required." The lawyer tried a different angle. "You've remarried, I understand. Rather quickly for a woman still pursuing justice for a first husband." Adeline's eyes went very sharp. "I have not remarried, Counselor. I suspect you are thinking of a case you'd rather be arguing." Her voice never once rose. "I'd be curious to hear you explain to this room why a woman's marital status has any bearing whatsoever on whether her husband was murdered." A ripple of quiet, appreciative laughter moved through the gallery, and the lawyer, visibly reconsidering his strategy, sat back down without further questions. Senna spoke of the cut girth. Agatha spoke of being taken, held, and the deliberate cruelty of men following careful orders. And when it was finally Garrett's turn, he laid the silver map on the judge's table, alongside the name of an assayer in Tucson, who, it turned out, had been rather easily persuaded to swear a truthful statement once he understood that the man who'd bribed him was no longer in any position to retaliate. Judge Ashby listened to the whole of it without interruption, exactly as he had the first time, except, when he finally spoke, his expression carried none of the careful, patient hedging it had carried in Larkspur. "This court finds sufficient evidence," he said, "to void the fraudulent land transfers connected to the deceased, to release all contested claims on the property known as Copperline back to its rightful holders, and to refer the matter of Cormac Voss's broader business dealings to a full territorial investigation." He looked out over the crowded room, and something in his sharp, tired eyes softened, just slightly. "I want it noted, for the record, that this territory owes a considerable debt to 5 people who refused to let a dead man's silence stand as the final word. That debt won't ever be fully repaid. But it can, at least, be acknowledged plainly, in open court, where everyone present can hear it." The gavel came down, and for the first time in longer than any of them could easily remember, the word justice stopped feeling, to Garrett, like an abstraction that happened to other, luckier people, and started feeling, dead, like something a person could actually reach out and hold. A month later, Rourke's own sentencing came down separately from the broader proceedings, and Judge Ashby weighed it with the same careful attention he gave everything else. 2 years of complicity did not simply evaporate because a man had finally, at the last possible hour, chosen the right side of a gun, but neither, the judge ruled, did a genuine, costly turn toward honesty count for nothing. "You'll serve 18 months, Ashby told him, at hard labor, for obstruction and dereliction. Not for the shooting itself, which 5 witnesses have sworn was justified beyond reasonable dispute. When you're released, Mr. Rourke, I'd suggest you find work considerably further from positions of unsupervised authority than the one you've just vacated." Rourke took the sentence without complaint, and when Garrett visited him near the end of his term, he found a man who'd grown leaner, quieter, and considerably more at peace with himself than he'd ever appeared wearing a badge. "Your brother's debt," Garrett said. "What happened to it once Voss's estate got sorted?" "Forgiven as part of the settlement. Ashby saw to it personally." Rourke almost smiled. "Funny thing, watching a debt disappear the very same month the man who'd have used it to ruin me finally stopped being able to ruin anybody at all. What'll you do once you're out? Don't rightly know yet. Something honest. Something small enough that if I get it wrong again, it doesn't cost anybody their life this time." He looked at Garrett, something like gratitude flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. "Thank you for not letting me stay the kind of man I was." "Wasn't my doing," Garrett said. "You're the one who turned the gun the right direction, in the end. Somebody had to remind me the direction existed." Rourke shrugged, small, tired. "Turns out that somebody was you." Kettering, for his part, testified fully in exchange for a reduced sentence, and served 4 years at territorial expense before drifting east out of the territory entirely once released, never to be heard from again by anyone at Copperline. Otis Pratt was never caught. Word drifted back, months later, that a man matching his description had turned up dead in a card game gone wrong 3 towns over, nothing to do with Copperline at all, just the ordinary end of an ordinary, unremarkable liar. Nobody at Copperline spent much time mourning either piece of news, and nobody spent much time celebrating it either. Both men had simply stopped mattering to the story of the people they'd hurt, which felt in its own quiet way like exactly the ending men like that deserved. The territorial investigation into Voss's broader dealings took the better part of the 2 years that followed, and unearthed a great deal more than any of them had expected, sitting in that crowded courthouse annex. 3 other ranches sold, under similarly false pretenses. 2 more supply contracts riddled with the same pattern of shorted goods and padded invoices, and a land office clerk in Tucson, who, once granted immunity in exchange for cooperation, produced enough forged transfer documents to keep territorial lawyers occupied for the better part of a decade, sorting out who actually owned what. Several families, scattered across 3 counties, found land quietly restored to them that they'd never fully understood they'd lost in the first place. It wasn't a clean reckoning, but it was. Garrett came to understand over those 2 slow years precisely the kind of justice that actually held. Not swift, not dramatic, just steady and thorough, and considerably more durable for having taken the long way around to arrive. That first winter closed in hard, same as it always did in that country, but Copperline had prepared for it properly this time, and the ranch held against every freeze the season threw at it. By the second winter, Agatha had finally opened her school in the loft above the barn, exactly as she'd once said she might. She taught reading and figures in the mornings, and in the afternoons, without apology, she taught the old songs too, the ones that had cost her a career once, in a schoolroom that had never deserved to have her in it. Word of the school spread slower than word of Voss's downfall had, but it spread all the same. And that same winter, 3 families rode in from their reservation to see for themselves whether the stories were true. Ida watched the wagons arrive from the porch, and Garrett noticed her hands had gone very still on the rail, her whole body braced in a way he hadn't seen from her since the earliest weeks he'd known her. "You're frightened," he said, quiet. "The last time my own people saw me," she said, "they told me I'd chosen a white man over them, and that choosing meant I didn't get to come back when it got hard." She didn't take her eyes off the approaching wagons. "I don't know how to stand in front of people who said that to me and not brace for it happening again." One of the women climbing down from the lead wagon was older, gray-streaked, and something in her face, when she finally spotted Ida on the porch, shifted from careful neutrality into something raw and unguarded. "Ida Marsh." The woman crossed the yard slow, testing the name like she wasn't entirely certain it would still be well spoken aloud. "I heard you were alive. I didn't let myself believe it until I saw your face just now. Aunt Nita." Ida's voice cracked clean in half on the 2 syllables. "I argued against turning you away," the older woman said, quiet, urgent, like she'd been carrying the confession a long while and needed finally to set it down. "I want you to know that. I argued and I lost, and I've regretted losing every single day since." She shook her head slowly. "That's not a shame I know how to carry lightly, Ida. I don't expect you to make it easy for me." Ida came down off the porch, steps slow, and for a long moment the 2 women simply stood there, studying each other across a gap built from years of hurt that didn't disappear, simply because somebody had finally said the honest thing out loud. Then Ida stepped forward and embraced her aunt fully, fiercely, both of them crying in the unguarded way of people who have been braced for rejection. So long they'd nearly forgotten what relief actually felt like arriving instead. "This is Sable," Ida said finally, pulling back, gesturing toward the little girl now peering curiously around the porch post. "My daughter." Nita crouched, studied Sable's face with open, searching tenderness. "She has your mother's eyes." "She does?" Ida's voice caught. "Nobody ever told me that. I'm telling you now." Nita straightened, looked around the yard, the school, the gardens, the mended fences, the whole architecture of a life, rebuilt from almost nothing. "You've done well here, child. I'd like to know you again if you'll let an old fool try." "I'll let you try," Ida said, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the words came without a single trace of the old bracing fear attached to them. An elder among the visitors, a broad-shouldered old man with white hair braided long down his back, spent the better part of that same afternoon speaking quietly with Senna in a language Garrett still hadn't learned more than a handful of words of, and when the conversation finished, the old man crossed the yard to where Garrett stood. Senna tells me you're building something honest here, the old man said, his English careful, deliberate. That's rare enough, in this country, to be worth riding out to see for myself. We're trying, Garrett said. Some days it feels more like stumbling into it than building it on purpose. The old man's mouth curved faint, almost amused. Most honest things start that way. He looked around at the school, the garden, the mended fences. If others wish to come, families, people with nowhere else the world has left open to them. Would that trouble you? It wouldn't, Garrett said without needing to think about it. There's good land here. Better shared than sitting empty. The old man nodded satisfied and touched Senna's shoulder once, brief, fatherly, before remounting and riding out with the others. He knew my mother, Senna said, quiet, once the riders had grown small on the horizon. Said she'd be proud. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that. By the following autumn, 3 families had settled permanently along Copperline's northern boundary, and what had once been a single failing ranch, slowly, stubbornly, became something closer to a proper settlement. Ida opened a small trading post that same year, selling baskets and pottery the women made together in the long winter evenings. And Sable grew up underfoot the whole time, walking, then running, then talking in 2 languages at once with the tangled fluency of a child who had never once been told that any part of who she was needed apologizing for. 2 years after the night he'd first walked into that guardhouse at Fort Reliance, Garrett asked Senna to marry him. They were mending fence, the 2 of them, well past the hour any reasonable person would still be working, and neither had complained about the extra hours spent stringing wire in failing light. You've gone quiet again, Senna said, echoing deliberately the word she'd used on the trail to Larkspur. Thinking. About Voss? About you. He set down the wire, turned to face her fully. I've been thinking about you for the better part of 2 years now, if I'm being honest about it, and I find I'm tired of only ever getting around to saying so in careful, roundabout ways. Senna went still, paying very close attention indeed. Say it plainly then. Marry me. No preamble. No careful softening. Build the rest of whatever this is turning into alongside me properly, with a name for it instead of just an understanding we keep circling back to. For a long moment she didn't answer, and Garrett felt his own heart doing something entirely undignified in his chest. Waiting. You waited 2 years to ask me that, she said finally, and then delivered it standing in the middle of a half-strung fence, at dusk, smelling like horse and creosote. I did. That's a terrible proposal, Garrett Holt. I know it. Something broke open in her face, then real, unguarded joy. The kind he'd only glimpsed from her in small, rare flashes over the 2 years he'd known her. Good thing I never much cared for the fancy version of anything, she said, and crossed the last 2 feet of distance between them, and kissed him there in the failing light, fence wire forgotten entirely on the ground beside them, and gave him her answer in a way that needed no further words attached to it at all. They married the following spring, in a ceremony that belonged to neither one tradition nor the other entirely, but some careful, deliberate blending of both. Agatha spoke the vows in English first, then Senna's own language second, and the whole gathered community of Copperline stood witness together. Apache families and drifters and townsfolk from Draycott who'd once whispered about squatters and now simply called the place home, same as everyone else standing in that yard did. Ida wove flowers into Senna's hair. Sable, 3 years old now, scattered petals down the aisle with the fierce, serious concentration only a small child brings to a task she's been told matters enormously. I promise to build honestly, Garrett said when it came his turn, the words plain, unpolished, exactly the way he'd wanted them. Not just the fences and the roof, though those too, but the harder kind of building. The kind that means staying, even on the days it costs something to stay. Especially those days. Senna answered him in her own language first, low and steady, and then watching his face carefully, translated it herself, unwilling to let the moment pass without him understanding every word of it. I promise the same, she said, and I promise to keep correcting your terrible pronunciation for as long as we both live. Because a man who stops trying to learn stops being worth staying beside. A small, unguarded smile broke through the solemnity of the moment. You are still terrible at it, Garrett Holt. I want that recorded, alongside everything else, as part of these vows. Laughter rippled warm through the gathered crowd, and Agatha, presiding, allowed herself the smallest satisfied smile before continuing. The celebration afterward ran long into the evening, food and music spilling out across the whole yard, and at some point Agatha cornered Garrett by the punch table, with the look of a woman who had been saving up a piece of commentary for exactly this occasion. "Do you recall?" she said. "The first night you stood in my kitchen, demanding to know what kind of trouble you'd ridden home to?" "Vividly. I distinctly remember thinking you'd give us a week before you found some excuse to run us off." She sipped her punch, satisfied. "I do enjoy being wrong about people. On the rare occasions it happens. You were never wrong about much else." "No," Agatha agreed, entirely without false modesty. "I generally wasn't. Which is precisely why you ought to have listened to me sooner about that fence wire." Across the yard, Ida had commandeered Sable for a slow, wobbling dance that consisted mostly of the little girl standing on her mother's feet while Ida did all the actual moving, both of them laughing at some private joke Garrett couldn't hear from this distance. Adeline stood near the edge of it all, watching the whole scene with a soft, quiet contentment that had taken 2 years and a great deal of patience to arrive at honestly. That same year in autumn, Adeline remarried a widowed rancher from Draycott, a patient, steady man named Walcott who'd lost his own wife 2 winters back and understood, without needing lengthy explanation, exactly what kind of grief a person carries quietly and exactly how much room that grief still deserves, even years on. She kept Marcus's ring, still, worn on its cord, but somewhere over those 2 years Garrett had noticed she'd stopped touching it quite so often, quite so anxiously, as though the weight of him had finally settled into something she could carry alongside her life instead of underneath it. That winter, before the first snow properly settled in, Garrett rode north alone for 3 days, farther than he'd told anyone he was going, until the country around him finally matched a landscape he'd spent 3 years trying very hard never to picture again. He found the creek without much difficulty. Memory, it turned out, kept a far more detailed map of the worst days of a man's life than it ever bothered keeping of the good ones. He sat his horse on the bank a long while, looking at water that ran clear and unremarkable and entirely indifferent to what it had once witnessed, and found to his own quiet surprise that the visit didn't break him open the way he'd half expected it to. "I'm not here to forgive myself," he said out loud, "to nobody, to the water, to whatever remained of a woman and a child whose names he'd never learned and would carry that failure for the rest of his life regardless. I don't think that's mine to do. I don't think it's owed to me either." He was quiet a moment, letting the wind move through the cottonwoods along the bank. "I'm here because I promised myself, a while back, that I'd stop letting this place be the only story I told about who I am. There's more of a story now. I wanted you to be part of hearing it, even if you can't." He stayed until the lights started failing, then rode back the way he'd come, and if the return journey felt lighter than the outbound one had, he supposed that was simply the nature of grief that finally gets allowed to sit alongside a life, instead of underneath it, not gone, never entirely gone, but no longer the only weight a man carried into every room he walked into. Senna was waiting on the porch when he rode in, 3 days later, and didn't ask where he'd been. Just watched him dismount, studied his face a long moment, and seemed to find, in whatever she saw there, everything she needed to know without requiring him to explain a single word of it. "Welcome home," she said simply. "It is that," Garrett agreed, and found, standing in the yard of a ranch that had once nearly broken him and had instead, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, put him back together in pieces he hadn't known were missing, that he meant it entirely. 7 years after the night the smoke first drew him home, Copperline had grown into something none of them, standing in that broken-down ranch house, that very first October night, could have properly imagined. 12 homes stood now, where there had once been one, scattered along both banks of Cupacca Creek, the same creek that had once nearly destroyed all of them, and now simply ran quiet and useful through the middle of a community that had long since stopped caring what lay buried beneath its water. The silver claim had been settled, eventually, through the territorial court, its proceeds split according to the same fair, deliberate principle that governed everything else at Copperline, shared according to labor and need, rather than hoarded according to whoever happened to hold the oldest piece of paper. Fields of corn and squash and beans stretched now across ground that had once been nothing but weeds and broken fencing. Agatha's school had grown into a proper building of its own, no longer squeezed into a barn loft, and she taught 2 full classrooms now, in 2 languages, without a single person left standing over her shoulder to tell her which parts of the lesson she was and wasn't permitted to include. Sable, 7 years old, sharp and quick and utterly unbothered by anybody's opinion of where she belonged, split her days between helping in Ida's trading post and pestering Agatha's older students with questions considerably more advanced than her age suggested she ought to be asking. Garrett and Senna had 2 children of their own, by then a boy and a girl, raised deliberately between both of their parents' worlds, taught to move comfortably in each one rather than being forced to choose. One evening that autumn, the whole community gathered around a bonfire built large enough to hold the season's harvest celebration, and Sable, curled against Ida's side, looked up at the assembled crowd of families, some Apache, some not, none of them related by blood, all of them bound together by something that had turned out, over 7 hard years to matter, considerably more than blood ever had, and asked the question children eventually always seem to ask, sooner or later, once they're finally old enough to notice the shape of the thing they've grown up inside of. "Why are we all so different?" she said. "But we all live here together anyway." Garrett looked at Senna. Senna nodded, small, encouraging, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he finally had a complete answer ready, one he'd apparently been assembling piece by piece for years, without quite realizing he was doing it. "Because family isn't only the people you're born to," he said. "It's the people you choose to stay for. Every single day, over and over, whether or not it's easy that particular day." He looked around the fire at Agatha, silver-haired and fierce ever, at Ida, laughing at something Sable had whispered to her, at Adeline, her hand resting easy in Walcott's after all these years, at Esna watching him with the same steady warmth she'd carried since the night she finally let herself say yes to him. And because different doesn't mean divided. It just means there's more of us to build something worth keeping. Sable considered that with the gravity small children, reserved for questions they've clearly been sitting with for a while, then nodded satisfied and went back to whatever complicated negotiation she'd been conducting, with the barn cat curled at her feet, entirely unaware of how completely her simple question had just summarized the whole of everything the people around that fire had spent 7 years building. Later that same evening, Agatha found Garrett refilling cups near the fire and drew him aside. "Sable asked me yesterday," she said, "whether she might help teach the younger children their letters once she's a little older. Said she wants to do it properly, in both languages. No apologizing for either one." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that's precisely how I started, once a long time ago, in a schoolroom that never deserved to have either of us in it." Agatha's eyes shone, bright and unmistakably proud, in the firelight. "I told her I'd be honored to teach her everything I know, so that one day she can carry it forward the same way, to whoever comes looking for a place like this one, long after the rest of us are gone." "That's a fine thing to build toward," he said. "It's the finest thing," Agatha agreed. "Better than land. Better than silver, certainly, whatever Cormac Voss might once believed. A person can lose land, can lose money in a single bad season." She looked at him, steady, certain. "Nobody can take back what you've properly taught somebody else to carry forward on their own. That's the only inheritance that's ever actually lasted in my considerable experience, Mr. Holt. I'd stake everything I have left on it." Later that same night, once the fire had burned low, and most of the community had drifted off toward their own scattered homes, Garrett walked up the ridge, alone the same ridge, where he'd first pulled his horse to a stop and seen smoke rising from a chimney that should have stood cold and empty. He stood there a long while, looking down at the valley the way he had that very first October morning, except everything about the view had changed so completely that it took him a moment to fully reconcile the 2 pictures in his mind, the half-dead ranch he remembered, and the small, scattered constellation of lit windows spread out below him now. Homes instead of one house, families instead of strangers, 12 fires instead of one, uncertain column of smoke that had once made his hand drift toward a gun out of pure old habit. He hadn't known, that first morning, what any of it would cost him, or what it would eventually give back in return. Hadn't known that 4 women and an infant, crying in a room he'd once called storage, would turn out to be the thing that finally taught him how to stop merely surviving his own life and start actually building something inside of it. Senna found him there, and stood beside him without a word, watching the same valley, the same scattered lights. The proof that a broken thing, given enough stubborn hands, and enough shared reason to keep trying, could be made whole again, not the same as it was before. Never that, but whole in some new shape entirely its own. Regrets? She asked eventually. Not one, Garrett said, not a single one. He put his arm around her, and together they watched the lights of Copperline burning steady against the dark 12 small fires instead of one uncertain column of smoke, and somewhere below them, in a house that had once stood locked, and empty and utterly alone, an entire community slept safely through a cold Arizona night, sheltered by nothing more complicated, in the end, than the daily choice of people who had decided once to stay.